The nightmare always began the same way. Darkness, the smell of gunpowder, screams that belonged to men who had long since returned to dust. Mason Reed's eyes snapped open, his chest heaving as if he'd run for miles. Moonlight spilled through the cabin window, casting silver shadows across rough-hewn walls. Sweat dampened his brow, despite the autumn chill that had settled over the Montana territory. For a moment, he simply breathed, waiting for his heartbeat to settle back into its familiar rhythm. 5 years since the war had ended, and still it haunted him, pulling him back into the darkness when he least expected it. Mason pushed himself upright, the old pine bed frame creaking beneath his weight. He reached for the water cup on his bedside table, his hands still trembling slightly. As he raised the cup to his lips, a sound cut through the night silence. The crack of leather against flesh. A sound that didn't belong to his nightmares. Mason froze, his body tensing. The sound came again, distant but unmistakable, carrying on the wind from the direction of whispering pines. The noise dragged him back, not to the war this time, but to another memory, a young stable boy cowering beneath a foreman's lash, while Mason had been too far away to stop it. He had sworn then that such sounds would never echo on his land again. Moving with purpose now, Mason dressed quickly. He pulled on worn denim pants, a cotton shirt, and the leather vest that had seen better days. His movements were efficient, practiced. The routine of a man who had learned that hesitation could cost lives. He stepped outside into the pre-dawn darkness. The air held the crisp bite of early autumn stars, still bright overhead. His breath formed small clouds that disappeared into the darkness. The mountains loomed like sleeping giants against the eastern horizon, their peaks just beginning to catch the first hint of approaching dawn. Mason's cabin stood alone on a small rise overlooking a modest spread of land. Not the largest ranch in the territory, but it was his hard-earned after years of saving every penny from his military pay. A place where he answered to no one, where the only orders were those given by nature herself. The crack of the whip came again, the sound carrying clearly in the still morning air. Mason's jaw tightened. He strode to the small stable beside the cabin, where his horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding named Sergeant, nickered softly at his approach. The animal sensed his urgency, standing perfectly still, as Mason saddled him with practiced efficiency. "Let's ride," he murmured, swinging into the saddle. The path to Whispering Pines was worn from years of travel, though Mason rarely made the journey except when necessary. The town held little appeal for a man who preferred solitude to the whispers that inevitably followed a veteran with scars that went deeper than skin. Sergeant's hooves pounded the packed earth, Mason leaning forward in the saddle, pushing for speed. The first rays of sunlight were just breaking over the eastern mountains when the scattered buildings of Whispering Pines came into view. The town had grown since Mason had first settled in the area. The discovery of gold in the nearby hills had brought an influx of miners, merchants, and all manner of folk seeking fortune. What had once been little more than a trading post now boasted a main street lined with wooden buildings, a church whose white steeple reached toward heaven, and the inevitable saloon where men drowned their failures or celebrated their rare successes. As Mason rode down the main street, the crack of the whip came again, followed by a child's cry that cut through him like a knife. He reined Sergeant to a halt, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene before him. A small crowd had gathered in the dusty street outside the general store. At its center stood a woman Mason recognized as Irene Faulkner, the tight bun of her gray-streaked hair and the severe cut of her dress as unforgiving as her reputation. In her hand, she held a leather whip, its tip stained dark. Before her, a small girl cowered in the dirt, her threadbare dress offering little protection against the morning chill or the woman's wrath. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her body curled into itself trying to become smaller, invisible. Worthless, just like your mother. Irene's voice cut through the morning air, sharp as broken glass. Nothing but trouble since the day you were born. The crowd watched, some with discomfort, evident in their shifting stances, others with the blank indifference that came from witnessing such scenes too often. Near the edge of the gathering, Sheriff Logan Wells stood with his arms crossed, his badge catching the early morning light. His expression revealed nothing as he watched the scene unfold. Mason dismounted his boots, hitting the ground with a heaviness that matched the weight in his chest. As he stepped forward, the child looked up, and something in her gaze stopped him cold. Her eyes were blue, not the pale blue of a summer sky, but the deep, rich blue that reminded Mason of the wildflowers that grew along the creek behind his cabin. Eyes that seemed familiar, though he couldn't place why. The girl's face was streaked with dirt and tears, a small trickle of blood running from her split lip. As Irene raised the whip again, the child's voice broke through her sobs. "Whipped like Mama was." She choked out the words, barely audible, but striking Mason like a physical blow. Time seemed to slow. The whip hung suspended in the air. Irene's face twisted with a rage that seemed too vast for the small child before her. The crowd's murmurs faded to silence in Mason's ears, replaced by the pounding of his own heart. Before he fully realized what he was doing, Mason had crossed the distance between them, his large hand closing around Irene Faulkner's wrist just as she began to bring the whip down. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but carrying the unmistakable tone of a man who had given orders in battle. Irene's head snapped up, her eyes widening with surprise and then narrowing with recognition. "Reed," she spat, trying to pull her arm free. "This is no concern of yours." "I'm making it my concern." Mason's grip remained firm, though careful not to bruise. "No child deserves this." The crowd stirred, whispers rippling through the gathered onlookers. Few in Whispering Pines had ever seen Mason Reed involve himself in town matters. The reclusive rancher was known more for his absence than his presence. "This girl is my ward," Irene hissed, her voice low enough that only Mason could hear. "Her mother left debts that need paying, and the girl will work them off. With her blood." Mason nodded toward the child, who remained huddled in the dirt, watching the exchange with wide, fearful eyes. "That's not work. That's cruelty." Sheriff Wells finally pushed himself away from the post he'd been leaning against, approaching with the unhurried gait of a man accustomed to being waited for. "Problem here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "No problem, Sheriff," Mason replied evenly, releasing Irene's wrist, but positioning himself between her and the child. "Just stopping something that shouldn't be happening in the first place." Wells's gaze shifted between Mason and Irene, then down to the girl. "Mrs. Faulkner has legal guardianship of the child," he said, his voice neutral. "After her sister passed the courts—" "I don't care about courts," Mason cut in. "I care about a child being beaten in the street while good folks stand by and do nothing." Irene straightened her back, pulling her dignity around her like armor. "Take her then," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "Take her if you think yourself so righteous, Reed. See how quickly she ruins your peace with her willfulness and her mother's wild blood." Mason didn't respond to the taunt. Instead, he knelt down, bringing himself to the girl's level. Up close, he could see that her dark hair, though matted and dirty, held hints of auburn when the sunlight caught it. Her face, beneath the grime and fear, held a stubborn set to the jaw that spoke of an inner strength the whip had not yet broken. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. The girl hesitated, eyeing him warily. "Lily," she finally whispered. "Lily." Mason nodded as if confirming something to himself. "I'm Mason Reed. Would you like to come with me? Away from here?" Lily's eyes darted to Irene, then back to Mason. The fear in them was evident, but so was a flicker of desperate hope. "She'll come after me," she whispered. "No," Mason said, his voice carrying a promise. "She won't." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a worn handkerchief. With gentle movements that belied his rough appearance, he dabbed at the blood on Lily's lip, then offered her his hand. After a moment's hesitation, her small fingers slipped into his. Her hand felt impossibly tiny bird-like bones beneath skin that had seen too much work for someone so young. Mason helped her to her feet, then surprised the onlookers by lifting her carefully into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a fact that tightened the knot of anger in his chest. "This isn't over, Reed," Irene called as he turned toward his horse. "That girl has debts to pay." Mason paused, looking back over his shoulder. "The only debt here is the one owed to her," he said quietly. "A debt of kindness that's long overdue." He set Lily carefully on Sergeant's saddle, then mounted behind her. The girl sat stiff with fear, her small body trembling. "Hold on," he murmured, reaching around her to take the reins. As they rode away from the town, Mason felt the weight of eyes following them, some curious, some disapproving, some relieved. Sheriff Wells watched from the edge of the street, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Once they had left the town behind, Mason slowed Sergeant to a steady walk. The morning sun had fully risen now, bathing the landscape in golden light. The rolling hills stretched before them, dotted with pine and aspen, the latter just beginning to turn gold with the approaching fall. Lily remained silent, her body gradually relaxing as the distance between them and whispering pines increased. Eventually, she spoke, her voice small but steady. "Are you taking me to the orphanage in Helena?" Mason shook his head, though she couldn't see the gesture from her position. "No, I'm taking you to my ranch. It's not much, but it's peaceful there." Will I have to work for you?" The question carried layers of meaning, the fear behind it making Mason's jaw tighten. "You'll be safe," he said simply. "At my place, you'll only know kindness, Lily. That's all that matters right now." The child didn't respond, but Mason felt some of the tension leave her small frame. They rode in silence for a time, the rhythmic sound of Sergeant's hooves creating a soothing cadence. "She said my mama had wild blood." Lily eventually said the words so quiet, Mason almost missed them. "What does that mean?" Mason considered his answer carefully. "It means your mother probably had spirit, that she didn't just bow her head and accept things that weren't right. Did you know her?" The question was direct, catching Mason off guard. "I might have," he admitted, memories stirring that he had long tried to bury. "What was her name?" "Margaret," Lily said. "Margaret Hayes." The name hit Mason like a physical blow, confirming a suspicion that had been growing since he'd first looked into Lily's blue eyes. Margaret Hayes. The woman who had saved his life during the war, who had helped him escape when he and Thomas had been captured. The woman whose smile had given him hope in the darkest days, whose absence had left a void he'd never managed to fill. Margaret, who had disappeared without a trace after the war, leaving Mason with only memories and unanswered questions. "She died in the mine," Lily continued, unaware of the storm raging in Mason's mind. "They said it was an accident." Mason swallowed hard, forcing his voice to remain steady. "I'm sorry, Lily. Truly sorry." The rest of the journey passed in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they crested the final rise, Mason's cabin came into view. A simple structure of logs and stone with a small barn beside it, and a corral where two other horses grazed peacefully. "This is it," Mason said. "Not grand, but it's home." Lily took in the scene, her expression guarded but curious. "It's quiet," she observed. "That it is." Mason guided Sargent toward the cabin. "Just the way I like it." He dismounted first, then reached up to help Lily down. Her legs buckled slightly when her feet touched the ground, and Mason steadied her with a gentle hand. "Come on inside," he said. "Let's get you cleaned up and fed." The interior of the cabin was simple but well-maintained. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a wooden table and chairs nearby. A bed stood in one corner with a chest at its foot. Shelves lined another wall, holding books, tools, and the necessary supplies for a solitary life. Mason quickly kindled a fire in the hearth, then filled a basin with water from a bucket near the door. He set it near the fire to warm, then rummaged through a trunk, pulling out a clean shirt. "It'll be too big," he said, offering it to Lily, "but it's clean. You can wear it while I wash your dress." Lily hesitated, clutching her tattered dress as if afraid to let it go. "I'll turn my back," Mason assured her, demonstrating by turning toward the fireplace. "Just let me know when you're changed." He heard the rustle of fabric, then a small voice. "I'm done." When Mason turned, he couldn't help the sad smile that tugged at his lips. Lily stood draped in his shirt, the fabric hanging to her ankles like a dress, the sleeves rolled up multiple times yet still covering her hands. She looked even smaller, if that were possible. "Let's tend to those cuts," he said, gesturing to the chair near the fire. Lily sat obediently watching with wary eyes as Mason dampened a clean cloth in the warmed water. With gentle movements, he began to clean the dirt and blood from her face. As he worked, he noticed more bruises and older scars that spoke of repeated abuse. Anger simmered in his chest, but he kept his touch gentle and his expression neutral, not wanting to frighten the girl. "How long were you with Mrs. Faulkner?" he asked, trying to keep his tone conversational. "Since Mama died," Lily replied. "Almost a year now." "And she's your aunt, your mother's sister?" Lily nodded. "She didn't like Mama much, said she was a disgrace." Mason's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their careful work. "People say a lot of things out of hurt or anger," he said carefully. "Doesn't make them true." As he helped Lily wash the dirt from her arms, Mason noticed something that made his breath catch. On the back of her right shoulder, partially hidden by her tangled hair, was a small birthmark in the shape of a crescent moon. Mason had seen that mark before in his shaving mirror every morning. The same crescent moon birthmark sat behind his own right ear, a trait his father had carried as well. The revelation struck him like lightning. Could it be possible? The timing would be right. Lily appeared to be around 8 years old. After he and Margaret had parted ways, he had spent months recovering from his wounds. By the time he was well enough to search for her, she had vanished. "Mr. Reed," Lily's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Are you all right?" Mason realized he had been staring at the birthmark. He quickly resumed cleaning a scrape on her arm. "Yes, just thinking," he said. "And you can call me Mason." Once he had tended to her visible injuries, Mason heated some stew that had been left from his own dinner the night before. He placed a generous portion in a bowl and set it before Lily along with a chunk of bread. The girl stared at the food as if she couldn't quite believe it was for her. "Go on," Mason encouraged. "You must be hungry." Lily needed no further prompting. She ate with the desperate speed of someone accustomed to having food taken away before she could finish. Mason said nothing, simply refilling her bowl when she emptied it, his heart heavy at the evidence of her mistreatment. After she had eaten, exhaustion began to claim her. Mason arranged blankets on a small cot he normally used for storage, creating a makeshift bed. "You can sleep here," he said. "Rest now. Everything else can wait." Lily climbed onto the cot, pulling the blankets around her. Her eyes, those familiar blue eyes, watched Mason warily. "Will she come for me?" she asked, her voice small. Mason shook his head firmly. "No, you're safe here, Lily. I promise." He waited until her eyes fluttered closed, her breathing evening out into the rhythm of sleep, before moving away. Only then did he allow the full weight of the morning's revelations to settle upon him. Margaret Hayes, the woman he had loved and lost during the chaos of war. The woman who had disappeared without a trace, leaving only memories and unanswered questions. And now, this child, a girl with Margaret's blue eyes and a birthmark identical to his own. A girl whose very existence upended everything Mason thought he knew about the past 8 years. Was Lily his daughter? The possibility thundered through him, equal parts terrifying and wondrous. If she was, why had Margaret never told him? Why had she allowed her sister, a woman who clearly despised her, to take the child after her death? Mason moved to the cabin's small window, looking out at the land that had been his refuge. The peaceful solitude he had built here now seemed on the verge of profound change. He had acted on instinct, unable to stand by while a child suffered. But in doing so, he had potentially opened the door to a past he had tried desperately to leave behind. As the day wore on, Mason tended to his usual chores, checking on his small herd of cattle, mending a broken fence rail, all the while keeping an eye on the cabin where Lily slept. His mind raced with questions, with possibilities, with fears. If Lily was indeed his daughter, what did that mean for the life he had built? Could he be a father when he could barely face his own demons? And if word got out that Mason Reed had taken in a child who might be his own, how long before the shadows of his past caught up with him? The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when Mason heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. He straightened from his work hand, instinctively moving to the rifle that leaned against the fence post beside him. A lone rider approached, the glint of a badge visible on his chest, even at a distance. Sheriff Logan Wells. Mason relaxed slightly, though his guard remained up. Wells was not an enemy, but neither was he a friend. The lawman operated in the gray area between justice and expediency, keeping the peace in Whispering Pines, but rarely rocking the boat when it came to the town's more influential citizens. Wells reined his horse to a stop a respectful distance away, removing his hat in greeting. "Reed," he said, his weathered face giving away little. "Sheriff," Mason acknowledged. "What brings you out this way?" Wells dismounted, tying his horse to the fence. "Thought we should talk about what happened in town this morning." Mason resumed his work on the fence, driving a nail with perhaps more force than necessary. "Seemed pretty straightforward to me. A child was being abused. I stopped it. Nothing's ever that simple, and you know it." Wells leaned against the fence, his posture casual, but his eyes sharp. "Irene Faulkner's raising hell in town. Says you stole her ward." "Can't steal what wasn't rightfully hers to begin with," Mason replied evenly. "That girl was being treated worse than a stray dog." Wells sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, Reed, I'm not saying what Irene was doing was right, but there are proper channels." "Proper channels?" Mason turned to face the sheriff fully now. "Like the ones that gave guardianship of a child to a woman who beats her in the street. Those channels—" A flicker of discomfort crossed Wells's face. "The courts made that decision after Margaret died. Irene was her only living relative." "Not her only living relative," Mason said quietly, the words escaping before he could stop them. Wells's eyes narrowed. "What are you saying, Reed?" Mason hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. He had no proof beyond a birthmark and a timing that aligned with his brief relationship with Margaret during the war. But the conviction in his gut grew stronger with each passing hour. Before he could formulate a response, the cabin door opened. Lily stood in the doorway, still drowning in Mason's oversized shirt, her hair tousled from sleep. Her eyes widened at the sight of the sheriff. "It's all right, Lily." Mason called, his voice gentler than Wells had likely ever heard it. "The sheriff's just paying a visit." Lily remained frozen in the doorway, her gaze fixed on Wells with undisguised fear. Mason excused himself from the sheriff and crossed to the cabin, crouching down to Lily's level. "No one's taking you anywhere," he assured her quietly. "I just need to talk with him for a bit. Why don't you go back inside? There are some books on the shelf if you'd like to look at them." After a moment's hesitation, Lily nodded, retreating back into the cabin. Mason watched until the door closed behind her, then returned to where Wells waited. "She's terrified," Wells observed. "With good reason," Mason replied. "How long has Irene been treating her that way?" Wells had the grace to look uncomfortable. There were rumors. Nothing concrete enough to act on. "Nothing concrete." Mason's voice hardened. "The girl's covered in scars, Sheriff. She flinches at sudden movements. That concrete enough for you?" Wells sighed. "It's complicated, Reed. Irene has connections in this town. Her late husband was Ezra Blackwood's cousin, and Blackwood... Mason repeated the name, sending a chill through him. "Ezra Blackwood owns the mine now. Owns half the valley," Wells confirmed. "Mine, lumber mill, most of the businesses in town one way or another. He's not a man to cross lightly." The pieces began to fall into place in Mason's mind. Ezra Blackwood, once a captain in the Union Army, the man who had betrayed his unit, who had left Mason and Thomas Hayes to die in a Confederate prison camp. The man whose actions had indirectly led to Thomas's death. The man Margaret had sworn to expose. "Sheriff," Mason said carefully, "how exactly did Margaret Hayes die?" Wells shifted his weight, his discomfort growing more evident. "Mining accident. Tunnel collapse. She shouldn't have been in there, but some of the women would sneak in after hours to glean what the miners missed." "And no one questioned it," Mason pressed. "A woman with a young child risking her life in an unstable mine shaft. People do desperate things when they're hungry, Reed. You know that." Mason did know. He had seen desperation drive good people to terrible choices during the war. But something about the story didn't sit right, especially now that he knew Blackwood was involved. "What does Blackwood have to do with Lily?" he asked directly. Wells hesitated. "Nothing directly, but he supports Irene's claim to the girl, says she owes labor for her mother's debts." "Labor?" Mason repeated the word, tasting bitter. "She's 8 years old, Wells." "I'm just telling you how things stand," the sheriff said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "And warning you that this won't end with you riding into town and riding out with the girl. Irene's determined to get her back, and Blackwood doesn't like being crossed." "Let them try," Mason said, his voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. Wells studied him for a long moment. "You know something about this girl that you're not saying, don't you, Reed?" Mason met his gaze steadily. "I know she deserves better than what she's gotten. That's enough for now." The sheriff sighed, reaching for his hat. "I can't stop what's coming, but I thought you should know. Blackwood's not the type to let things lie." "I appreciate the warning," Mason said, extending his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Wells shook it. "Take care, Reed, of yourself and the girl." Mason watched as the sheriff mounted and rode away, disappearing over the rise that separated the ranch from the road to town. Only when Wells was out of sight did Mason allow his shoulders to slump the weight of what he had learned pressing down on him. Ezra Blackwood. Of all the ghosts from his past, this was one Mason had hoped never to encounter again. The man who had betrayed his own men for personal gain, who had escaped justice through connections and bribery, while better men died. If Blackwood was involved with Irene Faulkner, if he had some interest in Lily, then the situation was far more dangerous than Mason had initially realized. He returned to the cabin, finding Lily seated at the table, one of his books open before her. She looked up as he entered, her expression guarded. "Is he going to take me back?" she asked directly. Mason shook his head. "No, not him, not anyone." Relief flickered across her face, though the wariness remained. "Aunt Irene says I have to pay for my keep. What work do you want me to do?" The question asked with such resignation made Mason's heart ache. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, making sure to keep his movements slow and non-threatening. "Lily," he said gently, "you don't have to work to earn your place here. This isn't about that." Confusion clouded her features. "Then why did you bring me? Everyone wants something." "I brought you because no child deserves to be treated the way you were being treated," Mason said simply. "Here you'll have food, shelter, and safety. No conditions." Lily stared at him, clearly struggling to understand a concept so foreign to her recent experience. "But Aunt Irene said—" "Your aunt was wrong," Mason interrupted, his tone firm but kind. "About a great many things, it seems." Lily fell silent, her gaze dropping to the book before her. Mason noticed it was a volume of poetry, one of the few books he had salvaged from his life before the war. "Can you read?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Mama taught me. She said books could take you places when your feet couldn't." Margaret's words. Mason remembered her saying something similar during those brief stolen moments they had shared. The memory brought a bittersweet ache. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," he said. "She was," Lily agreed, a flicker of pride breaking through her caution. "She knew lots of things. She could read and write, and she knew about plants that could heal people." Mason nodded, encouraging her to continue. Any information about Margaret's life after the war was precious to him. "She worked hard," Lily continued, her small fingers tracing the edge of the book. "But she always had time to teach me things. She said I needed to be smart, because someday I might meet my father, and she wanted him to be proud." Mason's heart skipped a beat. "Did she tell you about your father?" he asked carefully. Lily shook her head, disappointment evident in her expression. "Just that he was a good man who had to go away. She said he didn't know about me, but that wasn't his fault." The confirmation hit Mason with the force of a physical blow. He was almost certain now Lily was his daughter. Margaret had been carrying his child when they parted, and she had never told him. But why? The question burned in his mind. Why would Margaret keep such a secret, especially when it meant leaving their child vulnerable after her death? "Mr. Reed Mason," Lily's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Are you all right? You look sad." Mason managed a small smile. "Just thinking about the past, and about what happens next." "What does happen next?" Lily asked, the vulnerability in her voice, a reminder of how young she truly was. "Next we get you properly settled," Mason said, pushing aside his own turbulent emotions to focus on her needs. "You'll need clothes that fit, for one thing." Lily glanced down at the oversized shirt she wore. "This is fine," she said quickly. "I don't need—" "You do need," Mason interrupted gently. "And you'll have. That's not up for debate." A flicker of something hope perhaps crossed Lily's face, before she quickly schooled her expression back to careful neutrality. It was clear that life had taught her not to expect kindness a lesson, Mason was determined to help her unlearn. As evening approached, Mason prepared a simple but hearty meal. He noted with satisfaction that Lily ate with less desperate speed than before, though she still watched him carefully, as if expecting the food to be taken away at any moment. After dinner, as Mason was washing the dishes, Lily spoke again. "Why did the sheriff say Ezra Blackwood's name, and why did it make you angry?" Mason's hands stilled in the dishwater. He hadn't realized his reaction to Blackwood's name had been so visible. "You heard that?" Lily nodded. "Mama taught me to listen carefully. She said sometimes what people don't say is more important than what they do." Another piece of Margaret's wisdom. Mason dried his hands, considering how much to tell this child, who was already burdened with more knowledge of the world's cruelty than any 8-year-old should possess. "Ezra Blackwood and I knew each other during the war," he said finally. "He did something that hurt a lot of people. Good people." "Did he hurt you?" Lily's directness was startling. "Yes," Mason admitted, "but that was a long time ago." "Mama was afraid of him," Lily said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "She never said why, but I could tell. Whenever his name was mentioned, she would get very quiet and very still." Mason's suspicions deepened. If Margaret had feared Blackwood, if she had known of his wartime treachery, it could explain much about her disappearance and her silence regarding Lily's parentage. "Did Blackwood ever speak to your mother?" he asked carefully. Lily's brow furrowed in concentration. "Once. He came to our cabin late at night. I was supposed to be asleep, but their voices woke me. Mama was angry. She told him to leave, that she had nothing to say to him. He said she should remember what happened to people who spoke out of turn." A chill ran down Mason's spine. The implied threat was clear, especially knowing what he did of Blackwood's character. "After that, Mama started writing letters," Lily continued. "Late at night, when she thought I was asleep, she would seal them and hide them under a loose floorboard. She said they were insurance in case anything happened to her." "Do you know what happened to these letters?" Mason asked, trying to keep his voice casual despite the urgency he felt. Lily shook her head. "After Mama died, Aunt Irene took me to her house. I never got to go back to our cabin, but—" She hesitated, glancing toward the door, as if afraid someone might be listening. "I took one letter. The one Mama told me was the most important. She made me memorize where it was hidden." Mason's heart quickened. "Do you still have it?" Lily nodded, reaching into the small pocket of her tattered dress, which hung on a peg near the fire. She withdrew a folded piece of paper worn at the creases from being handled often. "Mama said if anything happened to her, I should find the man with the crescent moon mark," Lily said, holding the letter out to Mason. "The man who would protect me." With hands that trembled slightly, Mason took the letter. The paper was cheap, the kind sold at the general store, but the handwriting that addressed it was unmistakable. The same flowing script that had signed the few precious notes Margaret had sent him during the war. The letter was addressed simply, "To Mason Reed." Mason stared at it, a storm of emotions raging within him. Here, perhaps, were the answers to the questions that had haunted him since he'd first seen Lily in the street that morning. But he was suddenly afraid of what those answers might be. "Aren't you going to read it?" Lily asked, watching him closely. Mason nodded, carefully, breaking the seal. The letter was dated nearly a year earlier, not long before Margaret's death, if Lily's timeline was correct. "Mason, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and Lily has found her way to you as I prayed she would. She is your daughter, born 8 months after we parted. The crescent moon behind her right ear pricks her as yours, as surely as the same mark identifies you. I know you must wonder why I never told you why I disappeared without a word. The answer is both simple and terrible, Ezra Blackwood. After Thomas died in that prison camp, I swore to expose Blackwood's treachery. I had evidence Thomas's journal detailing Blackwood's betrayal, his selling of information to Confederate forces. But Blackwood's influence reached further than I anticipated. When I finally tracked him down after the war, he was already established here in Whispering Pines, a respected businessman with connections to judges and politicians. He made it clear that if I spoke out, it wouldn't be just my life at risk. By then, I knew I was carrying your child. I made the choice to disappear to protect both you and our unborn daughter from Blackwood's vengeance. I've regretted that decision every day since, wondering if I should have trusted you with the truth. But fear makes cowards of us all, and my fear for Lily's safety outweighed all else. Recently, Blackwood has become suspicious. He knows or suspects that I kept evidence of his crimes. I fear my time is growing short. I've entrusted this letter to Lily along with instructions to find you if anything happens to me. The full evidence against Blackwood is hidden where it all began, the place where Thomas died. You'll know where to look. Forgive me, Mason, for the years I stole from you and Lily. Know that I loved you then, and love you still, as does the daughter you never knew you had. With all my heart, Margaret Mason lowered the letter, his vision blurred with unshed tears. The confirmation of what he had suspected, that Lily was indeed his daughter, filled him with a fierce joy that was immediately tempered by grief for the years lost and for Margaret's tragic end, and beneath it all a cold anger toward Ezra Blackwood, whose treachery had cost him not only his brothers in arms, but the chance to know his own child from birth. "Was it from Mama?" Lily asked, her voice small. Mason nodded carefully, refolding the letter. "Yes, she wanted to make sure you found me." "Why?" The simple question carried so much weight. Mason looked at the child, his child, her blue eyes so like her mother's, watching him with a wariness born of too much hurt. "Because," he said gently, "I'm your father, Lily." Lily's eyes widened disbelief, and a flicker of hope warring in her expression. "My father?" Mason nodded, moving slowly to kneel before her chair, bringing himself to her level. "Your mother and I knew each other during the war. We were separated before she knew she was carrying you. She never had the chance to tell me about you. She said my father had a mark like mine," Lily said slowly, her hand moving unconsciously to touch the spot behind her ear where the crescent birthmark lay. "The moon mark." Mason turned his head slightly, brushing his hair aside to reveal the identical mark behind his own ear. The same mark my father had, and his father before him. Lily stared at the birthmark, then at Mason's face, searching for any sign of deception. Finding none, her expression crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. "Why didn't you come for us?" she asked, the hurt in her voice cutting Mason to the quick. "Mama waited. She said you'd come if you knew." "I would have," Mason said, his own voice rough with emotion. "I swear to you, Lily, if I had known about you, nothing would have kept me away. I searched for your mother after the war, but she had disappeared. Now I understand why." Lily's tears spilled over, tracking down her cheeks. "Mama said you were a good man, that you would protect me if anything happened to her." "She was right," Mason said firmly. "And I will protect you, Lily. You're safe now." He opened his arms, offering, but not demanding, an embrace. For a long moment, Lily remained still, tears continuing to fall. Then, with a small sob, she launched herself into his arms, her small body shaking with the force of her grief and relief. Mason held her gently, his own tears falling silently into her dark hair. In the space of a single day, his solitary existence had been upended, his past resurrected, his future irrevocably altered. Yet as he held his daughter, the child he had never known existed. Until today, he felt a sense of rightness, as if a piece of himself that had been missing for years had finally come home. But even as he comforted Lily, Mason's mind turned to the threats that loomed on the horizon. Irene Faulkner would not easily surrender her claim on Lily, and Ezra Blackwood, if Margaret's letter was correct, had much to fear from the evidence she had hidden, evidence that could destroy the empire he had built on betrayal and blood. The peaceful life Mason had constructed was about to become a battlefield once more. But this time, he would not be fighting for country or cause. This time, he would be fighting for his daughter. The moon was high when Mason finally settled Lily into the small cot. She had cried herself into exhaustion, the emotional weight of the day finally claiming her. Now she slept deeply, her small face peaceful for the first time since he had found her. Mason stood watching her for a long moment, still marveling at the twist of fate that had brought her to him. His daughter. The very thought filled him with equal parts wonder and terror. What did he know of raising a child, especially one who had already endured so much? Yet looking at her now, he knew with bone-deep certainty that he would move heaven and earth to keep her safe, to give her the childhood she deserved. With a silent promise to do better than his best, Mason finally turned away from the sleeping child and moved to the table. By the light of a single lantern, he reread Margaret's letter, his mind racing. The evidence against Blackwood was hidden where it all began, the place where Thomas died. The Confederate prison camp where Thomas Hayes had breathed his last, where Mason himself had nearly died before Margaret had orchestrated their escape. But that camp was hundreds of miles away, in what had once been Confederate territory. How could Margaret have hidden evidence there? And what exactly was this evidence? Thomas's journal she had mentioned, but was there more? As Mason pondered these questions, his attention was drawn to a small noise from outside, the subtle shift of gravel under a boot, a sound that would have gone unnoticed by someone without his wartime experience. Instantly alert, Mason extinguished the lantern with a quick motion. He moved silently to the window, peering out into the moonlit yard. A figure stood near the corral, the silver light gleaming off a familiar badge. Sheriff Wells had returned. Mason glanced at Lily, ensuring she still slept, then slipped outside, closing the cabin door softly behind him. His rifle remained propped inside the door, a deliberate choice. If Wells had returned with ill intent, Mason didn't want to escalate the situation immediately. "Twice in one day, Sheriff," Mason called quietly as he approached. "Must be important." Wells turned, his expression grim. "It is. Blackwood's on the warpath, Reed. As soon as I reported that the girl was here with you, he started gathering men. Says he's going to reclaim stolen property." The phrasing made Mason's jaw tighten. "Lily isn't property." "You know that, and I know that," Wells agreed. "But Blackwood's claiming she's bound by her mother's debts. He's got papers, legal ones by the look of them, showing Margaret Hayes borrowed money against her daughter's future labor." "Indentured servitude," Mason said flatly. "That's what they're calling it now." Wells shrugged. "Call it what you will. The courts around here tend to side with men like Blackwood." "Why are you telling me this?" Mason asked, studying the sheriff's face in the moonlight. "You could have let them ride up here and take me by surprise." A flicker of something shame perhaps crossed Wells's weathered features. "Maybe I'm tired of looking the other way," he said. "Or maybe I just don't like the idea of a child being treated as property. Either way, I thought you deserved a warning." "I appreciate it," Mason said, genuinely surprised by the sheriff's apparent change of heart. When can I expect them? Dawn, most likely. Blackwood's gathering men from the mine now. You should take the girl and go read, at least until this blows over. Mason considered the advice. It would be the prudent course to flee with Lily to seek safety elsewhere, perhaps in one of the larger cities where Blackwood's influence might not reach. But running would only delay the inevitable. Blackwood's reach was long, and his grudges enduring. And if Margaret's letter was correct, the evidence that could bring him down was hidden somewhere only Mason could find. I won't run, Mason said finally. This has been a long time coming. Wells sighed, shaking his head. I figured you'd say that. Blackwood's bringing at least a dozen men read. Good odds for a betting man, but not for a fight. I've faced worse odds, Mason replied, memories of the war briefly darkening his thoughts. Not with a child to protect, Wells countered. At least send her away somewhere safe. There is nowhere safe, not from Blackwood. Not if what I suspect is true. Wells studied him for a long moment. You know something about Blackwood that most folks don't you? Mason met his gaze steadily. Let's just say our history goes back further than Whispering Pines. The sheriff nodded slowly. War, Mason confirmed. Wells sighed, reaching for his hat. Well, I've done what I came to do. Warned you. What happens next is on your own head. And where will you be when Blackwood rides in? Mason asked directly. A flicker of discomfort crossed Wells's face. I'm sheriff of Whispering Pines Reed. My jurisdiction ends at the town limits. Convenient, Mason observed without heat. Wells replaced his hat, tipping it slightly. Good luck, Reed. You're going to need it. As the sheriff rode away, disappearing into the night, Mason stood for a long moment considering his options. Dawn would come all too soon, bringing with it a confrontation he had long avoided, but now could no longer escape. Ezra Blackwood, the man whose treachery had cost Thomas Hayes his life, whose threats had kept Margaret silent, was coming. And this time, Mason Reed would be ready for him. With grim determination, Mason returned to the cabin, his mind already formulating a plan to protect his newly discovered daughter from the storms that were gathering on the horizon. Dawn arrived with the silent urgency of a stalking predator. Mason had not slept the hours of darkness spent in preparation for what was to come. He had cleaned his rifle, counted his ammunition, and moved Sergeant and the other horses to the small meadow behind the cabin where they would be safe from whatever confrontation the morning might bring. As the first pale light crept over the eastern mountains, Mason stood at the cabin window watching the road from town. Lily still slept curled tightly on the cot, the exhaustion of yesterday's revelations claiming her until the very last possible moment. Mason's mind was clear-focused in the way it had been during the war when danger loomed. The years of peace had not dulled his instincts. If anything, they had sharpened them, honed by the solitude of his chosen life and the vigilance that came with living on the frontier. The letter from Margaret lay folded in his shirt pocket close to his heart. Its weight was both burden and comfort, a tangible connection to the woman he had loved and lost, and a roadmap to the truth that might finally bring justice for Thomas Hayes and security for Lily. A small sound behind him drew his attention. Lily was sitting up on the cot, her dark hair tousled from sleep, her blue eyes so like her mother's, watching him with solemn intensity. "They're coming, aren't they?" she asked, her voice small but steady. "Aunt Irene and Mr. Blackwood." Mason nodded, seeing no point in shielding her from a truth she had already deduced. "Yes, but you don't need to be afraid." "I'm not afraid for me," Lily said, surprising him with her insight. "I'm afraid for you." The simple statement, delivered with such earnest concern, touched Mason deeply. This child, his child, had known so little kindness in her short life, yet here she was worrying about his safety above her own. "I've faced worse," he assured her, crossing to crouch beside the cot, "and I don't intend to let anyone take you away. Do you understand?" Lily nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Mama said you were brave. She said you never backed down even when you should have." A ghost of a smile crossed Mason's face. It sounded like something Margaret would say, a compliment wrapped in gentle criticism. "Your mother knew me well," he acknowledged. He helped Lily dress in the clean clothes. He had found a shirt that had once been his cut down and roughly sewn to fit her small frame, and a pair of trousers similarly altered. The result was far from fashionable but functional until proper clothing could be obtained. "After breakfast," he said, leading her to the table, "I need to show you something important." Lily sat quietly watching as Mason prepared a simple meal of cornmeal mush, sweetened with the last of his honey. She ate steadily without the desperate rush of the previous day, though her eyes frequently darted to the window, as if expecting to see riders appear at any moment. When they had finished eating, Mason cleared the table and then lifted a section of the cabin's plank flooring, revealing a small, hidden space beneath. "If trouble comes," he explained, "and I tell you to hide, this is where you go. There's enough room for you to lie flat. Once inside, pull the boards over you and stay absolutely quiet, no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" Lily peered into the dark space, then looked back at Mason, her expression serious. "What about you?" "I'll handle whatever comes," he said firmly. "Your job is to stay safe. Promise me you'll do as I say." After a moment's hesitation, Lily nodded. "I promise." Mason replaced the floorboards, then took Lily's hand and led her to the back of the cabin, where a small door almost hidden by shelving opened onto a narrow path. "This leads to the meadow beyond the ridge," he explained. "If I tell you to run, this is your way out. Follow the path until you reach the creek. Then follow the creek upstream. There's a cave in the cliff face, hidden by brush. Wait there until I come for you." "And if you don't come?" Lily asked the question direct, but her voice trembling slightly. Mason knelt, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "I will come for you," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a vow. "But if something happens and I can't follow the creek all the way to its source, there's a trapper's cabin there, a man named Cooper. He's a friend. He'll help you." Lily studied his face as if memorizing every line and plane. Then, with a solemnity that belied her years, she nodded. "I'll remember." As they stepped back into the main room of the cabin, a flash of movement through the window caught Mason's attention. He moved quickly, positioning himself to see clearly while remaining partially hidden. A single rider approached the morning sun, glinting off something metallic on his chest. Not a badge this time, but a silver watch chain that Mason recognized even at a distance. "Stay inside," he instructed Lily, his voice dropping to the quiet, controlled tone he had used during combat. "Away from the windows." Lily retreated to the far corner of the cabin, without argument, her small face pale but composed. Mason checked his rifle, ensuring it was loaded, then stepped onto the porch, the weapon held casually but ready at his side. The rider drew closer, his posture rigid in the saddle, his attire speaking of wealth and position rather than the practicalities of frontier life. A black coat over a brocade vest, a high collar despite the promise of heat in the day to come, and gloves of fine leather that had never seen a day's honest work. Ezra Blackwood had aged since Mason had last seen him, his once dark hair now streaked with silver lines etched deep around his mouth and eyes. But the cold arrogance in his gaze remained unchanged, as did the calculating set of his jaw. He reined his horse to a halt at a distance that spoke of caution rather than respect. "Read," he called, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern education. "It's been a long time." "Not long enough, Blackwood," Mason replied evenly. A thin smile curved Blackwood's lips. "Still holding grudges, I see. The war's been over for years, Reed. Time to let old grievances rest." "Some things don't rest," Mason said. "Some debts don't fade with time." Blackwood sighed, as if dealing with a particularly stubborn child. "I didn't come to discuss ancient history. I came about the girl." "Lily," Mason said deliberately, using her name. "My daughter." A flicker of surprise crossed Blackwood's face, quickly masked. "Is that what Margaret told you? I'm afraid she was prone to fabrications in her later years." "The truth is written in blood," Mason countered. "The same birthmark that marks me marks her. She's my flesh and blood Blackwood, and she stays with me." Blackwood's expression hardened. "The girl is bound by her mother's debts, Reed. Legal documents signed and witnessed. Margaret Hayes borrowed against her daughter's labor. Those debts passed to Irene Faulkner as her nearest relative." "Unless a father claims his rights," Mason said. "Which I am doing. Now Lily stays with me." "You have no proof of paternity beyond a birthmark," Blackwood scoffed. "No marriage certificate, no acknowledgement of the child at birth. The courts will side with Irene." "The courts," Mason repeated, a hint of bitter amusement in his voice. "The same courts you've bought and paid for, just like you bought information during the war. Just like you bought your way out of a court-martial after Thomas Hayes died." Blackwood's face paled slightly, though his composure remained intact. "Careful, Reed. Those are dangerous accusations." "Not accusations," Mason said. "Facts. Facts that Thomas documented in his journal before he died. Facts that Margaret preserved." Now real alarm flickered in Blackwood's eyes. "Whatever Margaret may have told you, she had no proof. If she had, she would have used it long ago." "She had proof," Mason said, stepping forward, his grip on the rifle tightening slightly. "And she kept it hidden to protect her daughter, to protect my daughter from you. But she made sure I would find it if anything happened to her." It was a calculated risk, revealing what he knew. But Mason needed to understand the full scope of the threat Blackwood posed, needed to confirm his suspicions about Margaret's death. Blackwood's response told him everything. The man's face hardened into a mask of cold fury, all pretense of civilized discourse falling away. "Margaret Hayes died in a mining accident," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous pitch. "A tragic event, witnessed by multiple reliable men. The same fate awaits those who spread malicious rumors about respected citizens." The threat was unmistakable. Mason's suspicions crystallized into certainty. Margaret's death had been no accident. Blackwood had silenced her just as he had tried to silence Mason and Thomas years ago. "Leave my land, Blackwood," Mason said, raising the rifle slightly. "And don't come back." For a tense moment, Blackwood remained motionless, his eyes cold with hatred. Then, with deliberate slowness, he gathered his reins. "This isn't over, Reed," he said. "I'll be back with men and the law on my side. The girl will return to her rightful guardian, and you will regret challenging me." With that, he wheeled his horse and rode away, his back straight, his posture radiating the confidence of a man unused to defeat, temporary or otherwise. Mason watched until Blackwood disappeared over the rise, then turned back to the cabin. Lily stood in the doorway, her small face solemn. "He's going to bring men to take me away, isn't he?" she asked. Mason nodded, seeing no point in lying. "He'll try?" "Because of what Mama knew about what he did during the war." Mason studied her, surprised by her understanding. "Partly, and partly because men like Blackwood don't like being defied." Lily's gaze dropped to the floor, her hands twisting in the fabric of her oversized shirt. "It's my fault. If you hadn't helped me—" "Stop," Mason said gently but firmly, crouching to meet her eyes. "None of this is your fault, Lily. The choices adults make are their responsibility, not yours. Blackwood's actions, your aunt's cruelty, even my decision to bring you here, none of these are burdens for you to carry." Tears welled in Lily's eyes, though she fought to hold them back. "But what if they hurt you? What if—" "They won't," Mason assured her with more confidence than he truly felt. "I've faced men like Blackwood before. The important thing is keeping you safe." He led her back into the cabin, his mind racing. Blackwood would return, and soon likely with enough men to overwhelm any resistance Mason might offer. The smart play would be to flee with Lily, to put as much distance between them and Whispering Pines as possible. But flight would only delay the inevitable. Blackwood's reach was long, his influence extensive, and somewhere hidden where only Mason could find it was evidence that could bring the man to justice, evidence that Margaret had died to protect. No running wasn't the answer. Standing and fighting alone against overwhelming odds wasn't either. Mason needed a plan, one that would keep Lily safe while allowing him to uncover the truth Margaret had hidden. As he considered his options, Mason's gaze fell on Margaret's letter still lying on the table where he had left it. The key was there in her words. "The evidence against Blackwood is hidden where it all began, the place where Thomas died." The Confederate prison camp had been in Georgia, hundreds of miles away. There was no way Margaret could have physically hidden evidence there, which meant— "Lily," Mason said slowly, "did your mother have a box or trunk with things from before you were born? Something she might have kept from the war." Lily frowned, thinking. "She had a wooden box she kept under her bed. She never let me touch it, said it had memories that weren't for children." "Do you know what happened to it after she died?" Lily shook her head. "Aunt Irene took me away right after. I never saw our things again." Mason rubbed his jaw, thinking hard. If Irene had taken possession of Margaret's belongings, and if the box contained what Mason suspected it might, then the evidence could still be in Whispering Pines, possibly in Irene Faulkner's house. A daring plan began to form in his mind. But first he needed to ensure Lily's safety. "We need to prepare," he told her, his decision made. Blackwood won't wait long to return. The next hours were spent in quiet, purposeful activity. Mason showed Lily how to use the hiding place beneath the floorboards, making sure she could enter and exit quickly and silently. He packed a small bag with provisions, jerky hardtack matches, and a small knife, and showed her how to secure it to her back. He filled canteens with fresh water and placed them where they could be grabbed in an instant. Throughout it all, Lily watched and listened with an intensity that spoke of a child who had learned early that survival depended on attention to detail. As the sun climbed toward midday, Mason took a break from preparations to sit with Lily on the cabin's small porch. The air was warm, the sky a perfect cloudless blue that seemed to mock the storm gathering around them. "Tell me about her," Mason said quietly. "Your mother, what was she like after the war?" Lily considered the question, her small face thoughtful. "She was strong," she said finally. "Even when things were hard, she never cried where I could see. She sang a lot old songs about faraway places, and she told stories." "What kind of stories?" Mason prompted when Lily fell silent. A small smile touched the girl's lips. "Stories about a brave soldier who fought not for glory but because it was right. About a man who would walk through fire to help a friend." Her eyes, so like Margaret's, met Mason's. "I think she was talking about you." The simple statement hit Mason with unexpected force. The thought that Margaret had kept his memory alive for their daughter had painted him as someone worthy of admiration, despite their separation created an ache in his chest that was both sweet and painful. "Your mother was the brave one," he said softly, "raising you alone, protecting you from Blackwood, keeping the truth alive when it would have been easier to let it die." "She said the truth was all we had sometimes," Lily replied, with the gravity of one reciting an important lesson. "That lies might seem kinder, but they always came with a price." Margaret's wisdom preserved in her daughter's memory. Mason found himself wondering what kind of family they might have been had circumstances been different. Had Blackwood's treachery not torn them apart? Had Margaret felt safe enough to tell Mason about the child they had created? "She would be proud of you," Mason said, reaching out hesitantly to tuck a strand of hair behind Lily's ear, revealing the crescent birthmark that matched his own. "So brave, so smart." Lily leaned slightly into his touch, a small gesture of trust that meant more to Mason than words could express. The moment of peace was shattered by the distant sound of hoofbeats, multiple riders approaching at speed. Mason was on his feet instantly, his hand going to the rifle that leaned against the porch railing. "Inside." He ordered, his voice calm, but brooking no argument. "Remember what we practiced." Lily darted into the cabin without hesitation. Mason followed, closing the door firmly behind them. Through the window he counted at least 8 riders approaching Blackwood at their head. More than Mason had hoped for, fewer than he had feared. "They're here," he told Lily, who stood near the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. "I want you to hide now. No matter what you hear, don't come out until I call for you. Understand?" Lily nodded, her face pale but determined. "Be careful," she whispered. "Always." Mason promised, helping her into the hiding place. Once she was settled, he replaced the floorboards, ensuring they looked undisturbed, then moved to the window to assess the approaching threat. Blackwood had brought miners, by the look of them rough men accustomed to hard work and hard living. They carried a mix of weapons, rifles, shotguns, a few pistols. Not professional gunmen then, but dangerous nonetheless, especially given the odds. Mason checked his rifle one last time, then stepped onto the porch as the riders drew to a halt in the yard. His stance was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, taking in every detail of the men before him. "Blackwood," he acknowledged coolly. "I see you brought friends." Ezra Blackwood sat tall in his saddle, his expensive clothes out of place among the rough attire of his companions. "I brought the law." "Read," he replied, holding up a folded paper. "A writ from Judge Harmon, authorizing the return of the minor child Lily Hayes to her legal guardian, Irene Faulkner. Bought and paid for, no doubt." Mason observed his tone conversational despite the tension thrumming through him. Blackwood's expression hardened. "The girl Reed. Where is she?" "Safe," Mason replied. "And staying that way." One of the miners, a barrel-chested man with a scar bisecting his left cheek, spat into the dirt. "We ain't got time for this, Blackwood. Let's just take her and be done." "Careful," Mason warned, his rifle still held casually but ready. "The first man who sets foot on my porch, uninvited, will regret it." The miners exchanged glances, a few shifting uncomfortably in their saddles. They had been paid to intimidate, perhaps, to rough up a stubborn rancher, but facing a man who had clearly seen combat, A man whose eyes held the steady, unflinching gaze of someone who had killed before, and would do so again if necessary, gave them pause. Blackwood sensed their hesitation and scowled. "The man is alone," he reminded them. 8 against 1. Those are odds even Reed can't overcome. "I've faced worse," Mason said quietly, and walked away. A tense silence fell, broken only by the nervous shifting of horses and the whisper of wind through the pine trees that bordered the clearing. Mason remained motionless, his eyes never leaving Blackwood's face, reading the calculation there, the weighing of risk against reward. Finally, Blackwood made his decision. "Daniels, Fletcher, check the barn," he ordered 2 of the men. "Carson, take Williams and circle around back. The rest of you with me." Mason's jaw tightened as the men began to move. He had hoped to avoid bloodshed, but Blackwood was forcing his hand. "This is your last warning, Blackwood," he called. "Take your men and leave. The girl stays with me." Blackwood's only response was a cold smile. He dismounted the paper still clutched in his hand and started toward the porch. 3 miners followed while the others split off as directed. Mason raised his rifle, aiming directly at Blackwood's chest. "Not another step." Blackwood halted, but his smile remained. "You won't shoot Reed. Not in cold blood. Not with witnesses. To protect my daughter." Mason's finger tightened slightly on the trigger. "Try me." Something in his tone must have convinced Blackwood of his sincerity, for the man stopped, raising his hands slightly. "Let's be reasonable," he said, his voice taking on a placating tone. "The law is clear. The girl belongs with her aunt." "The law recognizes a father's rights," Mason countered. "Lily is my daughter, Blackwood. My blood, and she's staying with me." "You have no proof of paternity that would stand up in court," Blackwood argued. "No documentation, no witnesses. Just your word against established legal guardianship." "I have Margaret's letter," Mason said. "And I have the truth about what happened to Thomas Hayes. The truth you've been running from since the war." Blackwood's face paled slightly, though his composure remained intact. "Ancient history," he dismissed, though his voice lacked its previous confidence. "Irrelevant to the current situation." "Is it?" Mason challenged. "Is Margaret's death irrelevant to the mining accident that was so convenient for you?" Now real fear flickered in Blackwood's eyes, quickly masked behind anger. "Careful, Reed. That sounds dangerously like slander." "It's only slander if it's not true," Mason replied. "And we both know the truth, don't we? Just like we know what really happened to Thomas in that prison camp." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was broken by a shout from behind the cabin. "Boss found something." Blackwood's attention wavered for just an instant, but it was enough. Mason seized the moment, covering the distance between them in 2 long strides, the butt of his rifle connecting solidly with Blackwood's jaw before the man could react. Blackwood went down hard, blood spurting from his split lip. The miners who had accompanied him surged forward, but Mason was already moving, ducking beneath a wild swing from the first man and driving his fist into the solar plexus of the second. Years of solitary life had not dulled Mason's combat instincts. If anything, the daily physical labor of ranching had kept him strong, his movements efficient and purposeful as he fought. But 3-to-1 odds were still daunting. A blow caught Mason in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. He staggered back, using the rifle as a staff to keep his attackers at bay while he struggled to regain his breath. The sound of splintering wood from within the cabin told him the men Blackwood had sent around back had forced their way in. Desperation lent Mason strength. He couldn't let them find Lily. With a roar that was as much pain as rage, Mason surged forward, catching one miner with a vicious uppercut that sent the man sprawling. The second tried to grapple with him, but Mason broke his hold with a twist and strike that left the miner clutching a broken wrist. The third man, seeing his companions dispatched so efficiently, took a step back, uncertainty written in his stance. Mason didn't wait for him to regain his courage. He drove forward, the rifle held horizontally, forcing the man back until he tripped over Blackwood's still prone form and went down in a tangle of limbs. Without pausing, Mason sprinted for the cabin door, heart pounding with fear for Lily. If they found her hiding place, he burst through the door to find two miners tearing the cabin apart, upending furniture, and pulling books from shelves. They turned at his entrance, one raising a pistol with more haste than aim. Mason didn't hesitate. He fired the rifle's report, deafening in the confined space. The miner screamed, the pistol flying from his suddenly limp hand, blood streaming from a wound that had barely grazed his arm, but had been enough to break his nerve. The second miner launched himself at Mason with a wordless cry, a knife glinting in his hand. Mason pivoted, using the man's momentum against him, and sent him crashing into the wall. The impact knocked the breath from the miner, the knife clattering to the floor from nerveless fingers. "Get out!" Mason ordered, his voice deadly quiet, as he leveled the rifle at the wounded man. "Both of you, now!" The miners needed no further encouragement. They stumbled out of the cabin, the wounded one clutching his bleeding arm, the other supporting him with a fearful glance back at Mason. Mason quickly scanned the room, relief washing through him when he saw that the floorboards concealing Lily remained undisturbed. But his respite was short-lived. Outside, he could hear Blackwood rallying his men. "Burn it!" Blackwood's voice carried clearly through the open door. "Burn the cabin! Smoke them out!" Mason cursed under his breath. Fire was the one threat he had hoped to avoid. In the dry conditions of late summer, a blaze could quickly consume the entire cabin, leaving nowhere to hide. He had to get Lily out. Moving quickly to the hidden compartment, Mason knelt and lifted the boards. Lily looked up at him, her face pale with fear, but her eyes clear and focused. "We need to go," Mason said urgently. "They're going to set fire to the cabin." Lily scrambled out of her hiding place, her movements quick and sure despite her fear. "The back door," she whispered. Mason nodded, grabbing the small pack he had prepared and slinging it over her shoulders. "Straight to the creek, like we discussed. I'll be right behind you." A crash from outside, followed by the crackling sound of flames catching dry wood, told him they had little time. Smoke was already beginning to seep through the walls where the miners had splashed kerosene. Mason led Lily to the hidden rear door, checking carefully before opening it. The two miners Blackwood had sent to circle the cabin were visible in the distance, returning from the barn with burning torches. They hadn't yet spotted the concealed exit. "Now," Mason whispered, giving Lily a gentle push. "Run for the trees. Don't look back." Lily hesitated for just a moment, her small hand squeezing his. "You'll come?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I promise," Mason assured her. "Now go." Lily darted away, her small form quickly disappearing into the underbrush that led toward the creek. Mason watched until she was out of sight, then turned back to face what was coming. The cabin was burning now, flames licking up the outer walls, smoke thickening inside. Mason knew he had only moments before the structure became a death trap. But he couldn't leave yet, not without retrieving something essential. Moving quickly through the thickening smoke, Mason went to his bed and knelt beside it. From beneath the frame, he pulled a weathered leather satchel, its surface scarred by years of use. Inside were the few possessions he truly valued: his discharge papers from the army, a faded photograph of his parents, a small pouch containing his military pay saved over years, and most importantly, a journal bound in faded blue cloth. His own record of the war, including the events leading to Thomas Hayes's death and Blackwood's betrayal. Not evidence on its own, perhaps, but combined with whatever Margaret had hidden, it might be enough to bring Blackwood to justice. Slinging the satchel over his shoulder, Mason headed for the rear door, coughing as the smoke grew denser. Outside, he could hear Blackwood shouting orders, the sound of men surrounding the cabin. Mason had almost reached the door when a burning beam crashed down before him, blocking his path. Heat seared his face, forcing him back. The fire was spreading faster than he had anticipated, fed by the dry timber of the cabin's construction. He turned, seeking another exit, but flames now blocked the main door as well. The window, it was his only chance. Mason wrapped his arm in his coat, using it to shield his face as he smashed through the glass. Jagged shards tore at his skin, but he barely felt the pain, driven by the need to escape to reach Lily. He tumbled out into the yard, rolling to extinguish any sparks on his clothing. For a moment, he lay gasping in the dirt, lungs burning from smoke, blood seeping from numerous small cuts. "There he is!" a voice shouted, and Mason looked up to see Blackwood pointing in his direction, blood still trickling from his split lip. "Get him!" Mason struggled to his feet, gripping his satchel with one hand and drawing his pistol with the other. He fired a shot into the air, the report causing the approaching miners to falter. "That's your warning," he called, his voice rough from smoke. "The next one finds flesh." The miners hesitated, looking to Blackwood for direction. Mason used their indecision to back slowly toward the tree line, keeping his pistol trained on Blackwood. "This isn't over. Read," Blackwood called, hatred evident in every line of his face. "The girl can't run forever. Neither can you." "Maybe not," Mason acknowledged, continuing his careful retreat. "But I'll make sure justice finds you before that happens." And with those words, he turned and sprinted for the trees, expecting at any moment to feel a bullet tearing into his back. But no shots came. Either Blackwood had ordered his men to hold their fire, or they lacked the will to shoot a man in the back. Mason didn't question his good fortune. He ran, ignoring the pain of his injuries, driven by the need to find Lily, to ensure she had reached safety. Behind him, his cabin, the home he had built with his own hands, collapsed in a shower of sparks and flame, years of solitary existence reduced to ash in minutes. But Mason felt no regret for the loss. A cabin could be rebuilt. What mattered now was Lily and the truth that could keep her safe from men like Blackwood. The creek lay a quarter-mile through dense forest, a journey Mason could normally make in minutes. But smoke inhalation and his injuries slowed his pace. By the time he reached the water's edge, his lungs burned and blood had soaked through his shirt from cuts made by the window glass. "Lily!" he called, his voice hoarse. "Lily! It's me!" For a heart-stopping moment there was no response. Then from behind a stand of willows, Lily's small form emerged. She was wet to the knees, having clearly waded through the shallow creek as instructed. "You're hurt!" she cried, running to him, her eyes wide at the sight of his bloodied appearance. "Just cuts," Mason assured her, dropping to one knee to embrace her briefly. "Nothing serious. Did anyone follow you?" Lily shook her head. "I didn't see anyone. I did just like you said, stayed in the creek so they couldn't track me." Pride swelled in Mason's chest, momentarily overshadowing his pain. This child, his child, had courage and presence of mind beyond her years. "Good girl," he said. "We need to keep moving. It won't take them long to realize we've escaped." "Where will we go?" Lily asked, falling into step beside him as he led her upstream, staying within the creek to mask their trail. "First to the cave," Mason replied, his mind working rapidly. "We'll rest there, tend to these cuts. Then Then we need to find that box of your mother's." Lily looked up at him, confusion evident in her expression. "But Aunt Irene has it. We can't go back to town." "Not directly," Mason agreed. "But there's more than one way to recover what's rightfully yours." They continued upstream, the cool water soothing Mason's aching feet as they waded through shallow sections. The cave he had mentioned lay a mile further hidden in a cliff face that bordered the creek. Mason had discovered it years ago while hunting and had occasionally used it as shelter during bad weather. As they walked, Mason considered their options. Blackwood would have men watching the roads, possibly even searching the surrounding wilderness. The cave would provide temporary shelter, but they couldn't stay there indefinitely. Sooner or later, they would need to retrieve the evidence. Margaret had hidden evidence that might be their only hope of bringing Blackwood to justice and securing Lily's future. "Tell me more about your aunt's house," Mason said as they walked. "Where did she keep your mother's thing?" Lily frowned in concentration. "There's a room upstairs that's always locked. Aunt Irene goes in there sometimes, but never when I'm around. I think that's where she put Mama's box." "And the house itself? How many doors, windows? Who else lives there?" "Just Aunt Irene," Lily replied. "It's a big house for one person. 2 stories with a porch all around. There's a front door and a back door that leads to the garden. Windows everywhere, but they're always locked at night." Mason nodded, filing away the information. Breaking into Irene Faulkner's house would be risky, especially now that Blackwood would have the town on alert. But if Margaret's evidence was indeed hidden there, they had little choice. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when they finally reached the cave. Mason helped Lily climb the steep path that led to its entrance, hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines and brush. Inside, the temperature dropped noticeably, the air cool and damp. The cave extended back further than it appeared from outside, with a high ceiling that allowed them to stand comfortably. "Wait here," Mason instructed, setting down his satchel. "I'll gather some wood for a small fire." Lily settled on a relatively flat rock, watching as Mason disappeared back through the cave entrance. She looked small and vulnerable in the dim light, her clothes still damp from the creek, her face smudged with dirt. Yet there was a resilience in her posture, a stubborn set to her jaw that reminded Mason powerfully of Margaret. Outside, Mason quickly gathered fallen branches and dry grass for tinder, keeping a watchful eye on the surrounding forest. There was no sign of pursuit yet, but he knew Blackwood would not give up easily. The man had too much to lose if the truth about his wartime betrayal came to light. Returning to the cave, Mason built a small fire near the entrance where the smoke would be drawn outward rather than filling the cave. The flames provided both warmth and light as the day began to fade into evening. Once the fire was burning steadily, Mason turned his attention to his injuries. He removed his shirt, wincing as the fabric pulled away from cuts that had begun to scab. None were particularly deep, but collectively they had left him weakened from blood loss and pain. Lily watched with solemn eyes as Mason used water from the canteen to clean the worst of the cuts. Without being asked, she tore a strip from the bottom of her oversized shirt and offered it as a bandage. "Thank you," Mason said, touched by the gesture. "You're handy to have around in a crisis." A small smile flickered across Lily's face there, and gone so quickly Mason almost missed it. "Mama taught me," she said, knowing how to help hurt people was important. "Your mother was a wise woman," Mason said, allowing Lily to help him wrap the makeshift bandage around a particularly nasty cut on his forearm. "She saved my life during the war. Did you know that?" Lily shook her head, her hands stilling in their work. "She never told me that part." Mason leaned back against the cave wall, memories washing over him. "It was after Thomas, your uncle, and I were captured. The Confederate prison camp was A bad place. Men died every day from disease, starvation, exposure. Thomas was sick, very sick. I thought I would lose him. What happened? Lily prompted when Mason fell silent. Your mother happened, Mason continued, his voice soft with remembrance. She was working as a nurse in a nearby town. Somehow, she learned we were in the camp. She bribed guards, smuggled in medicine for Thomas, food for both of us, and eventually she helped us escape. But Uncle Thomas still died, Lily asked, her blue eyes, so like Margaret's, fixed intently on Mason's face. Mason nodded, grief still sharp after all these years. Yes, he was too weak from the camp. He died on the journey north. He hesitated, then added, but before he died, he wrote down everything he knew about Blackwood's betrayal. How Blackwood had sold information to the Confederates, information that led to the capture of our unit. How he'd arranged to be captured, separately given preferential treatment, while the rest of us suffered. And that's what Mama kept hidden? Lily asked, understanding dawning in her expression. Uncle Thomas's proof? I believe so, Mason confirmed. Your mother was determined to see justice done, but Blackwood's influence was too great. When she realized he had essentially bought the town, she must have decided to hide the evidence until she could find a way to use it safely. But then she died, Lily said quietly. In the mine. Yes, Mason agreed, the anger he felt toward Blackwood burning cold and steady in his chest. In an accident that was far too convenient for certain parties. Lily fell silent, absorbing this information with the gravity of one much older. Finally, she asked, what do we do now? Mason sighed, running a hand through his hair. We rest tonight. Tomorrow we find a way into town to your aunt's house. We recover your mother's box and whatever evidence it contains, and then we find someone who can use that evidence to bring Blackwood to justice. The sheriff, Lily suggested. Mason shook his head. Wells may be having second thoughts about Blackwood, but he's not strong enough to stand against him directly. No, we need to reach the federal marshal in Helena. With enough evidence, he could bring charges that even Blackwood's money couldn't dismiss. As night fell fully, Mason spread his coat on the cave floor, creating a makeshift bed for Lily. The girl curled up on it without complaint, though Mason could see the exhaustion and fear she was trying to hide. Try to sleep, he encouraged, settling nearby with his back against the cave wall, his pistol within easy reach. I'll keep watch. Lily's eyes, luminous in the dying firelight, studied him with an intensity that seemed beyond her years. Will you tell me more about you and Mama? The request caught Mason off guard, a lump forming in his throat at the thought of sharing those precious, painful memories. But looking at Lily, this unexpected daughter who had Margaret's eyes and his stubborn chin, he knew she deserved to hear the story of the parents who had loved each other, however briefly, in the midst of war's chaos. We met in the spring of 1863. He began, his voice soft with remembrance. Your mother was tending wounded soldiers in a field hospital near Fredericksburg. As Mason spoke, weaving the tale of his brief, intense relationship with Margaret Hayes, Lily's eyes gradually grew heavy. By the time he described their painful parting, Mason ordered back to his unit, Margaret remaining to care for the wounded. She had drifted into sleep, her small face peaceful for the first time since he had found her. Mason watched over her through the night, his mind filled with memories of Margaret and plans for the dangerous day that lay ahead. Outside, the forest whispered with night sounds, the rustle of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant yip of a coyote. Somewhere out there, Mason knew Blackwood was searching for them. The man had too much to lose to simply let them disappear. If Thomas's journal contained what Mason suspected it did, it could mean not just disgrace for Blackwood, but imprisonment, perhaps even hanging for the deaths his betrayal had caused. Mason checked his weapons, counted his remaining ammunition, and prepared himself for what was to come. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges. But for tonight, in this hidden cave, his daughter slept safely under his protection. It was, Mason reflected, as he kept his silent vigil, more than he had dared hope for just 2 days ago. Whatever came next, he would face it with the knowledge that he was no longer fighting just for the past, for justice, long delayed. Now he was fighting for a future, Lily's future. And that made all the difference. The first light of dawn filtered through the cave entrance, casting long shadows across the stone floor. Mason had dozed fitfully through the night, never fully surrendering to sleep, his senses attuned to any sound that might signal danger. Now, as the forest outside began to stir with morning activity, he carefully checked his weapons and supplies, preparing for the day ahead. Lily still slept curled on his coat, her small face peaceful in repose. Mason watched her for a moment, marveling again at the twist of fate that had brought his daughter to him after 8 years of unknowing. In her features, he could see both Margaret's delicate beauty and his own stubborn jaw, a perfect blending of two people who had loved briefly but intensely amid war's chaos. He hated to wake her, to drag her back into the danger that pursued them. But time was not on their side. By now, Blackwood would have men searching the hills, and their temporary sanctuary could not remain secure forever. "Lily," he called softly, touching her shoulder. "It's morning. We need to move." Her eyes opened immediately, without the confusion of a child gradually waking. Instead, she was instantly alert, a skill learned from a life where danger might come at any moment. The realization pained Mason, though he recognized its value in their current situation. "Are they coming?" she asked, sitting up and quickly folding his coat. "Not yet," Mason assured her, "but we can't stay here. We need to reach town before Blackwood's men cut off all approaches." They shared a small breakfast of jerky and water from the canteen, eating in silence as Mason considered their options. The direct route to Whispering Pines would be watched, as would the main trails. Their best chance would be to approach from an unexpected direction, perhaps from the higher ridges to the east. "The climb will be hard," he warned Lily as they prepared to leave, "but it's our safest path. Can you manage it?" Lily nodded, her expression solemn but determined. "I'm stronger than I look." "I don't doubt it," Mason replied with a slight smile. "You're your mother's daughter." They emerged from the cave into the cool morning air, the forest around them still draped in the mist that often settled in the valley overnight. Mason led the way, moving cautiously, alert for any sign of pursuit. Lily followed close behind, her small boots making barely a sound on the forest floor. Their path took them away from the creek, climbing steadily into the foothills that flanked the eastern side of the valley. The going was rough, steep inclines, loose shale, that shifted underfoot, thick undergrowth that snagged at clothing and scratched exposed skin. Mason kept a careful eye on Lily, ready to assist if she faltered, but she matched his pace with surprising stamina. By mid-morning, they had gained enough elevation to see across much of the valley. In the distance, a thin column of smoke still rose from the remains of Mason's cabin, a stark reminder of all they had lost. Closer, moving along the main trail that led from town to the ranch, several riders were visible, Blackwood's men still searching. "They're persistent," Mason murmured, more to himself than to Lily. "Mr. Blackwood is afraid." Lily observed her gaze, following the distant riders. "Mama said fear makes men do terrible things." Mason glanced at her, struck again by the wisdom beyond her years. "Your mother was right about many things," he said. "Blackwood fears the truth we might uncover. That makes him dangerous." They continued their journey, keeping to the higher ground, where trees and rock formations provided cover. The sun climbed toward its zenith, the day growing warmer. Mason rationed their water, carefully aware that they would not find another creek until they descended into the valley near town. As they walked, Mason's mind turned to their plan. Breaking into Irene Faulkner's house would be dangerous under any circumstances. With Blackwood's men searching for them, the risk multiplied. Yet they had no choice. Without the evidence Margaret had hidden, they had no hope of bringing Blackwood to justice or securing Lily's future. "Tell me more about your aunt's house," Mason said as they paused to rest in the shade of a large pine. "You mentioned a locked room upstairs. Do you know which room? Would you recognize it?" Lily nodded, taking a small sip from the canteen he offered. "It's at the end of the hall with a big window that looks out over the garden. Aunt Irene keeps the key on a chain around her neck. I've never seen inside, but I heard her talking to herself in there sometimes." "Talking to herself?" Mason repeated, curious. "More like arguing," Lily clarified, "like she was angry at someone who wasn't there. She'd say things like, 'You always thought you were better, and you took what was mine.'" Mason frowned, processing this information. The relationship between Margaret and her sister seemed more complex than he had initially assumed. "Did your mother ever speak about her sister, about why they were estranged?" Lily's brow furrowed in concentration. "Not really. Just that they'd grown apart after their parents died. But once, when she thought I was asleep, I heard Mama tell a friend that Aunt Irene had never forgiven her for something that wasn't her fault." Another piece of the puzzle, though Mason wasn't sure yet how it fit. He made a mental note to explore this further if the opportunity arose. They resumed their journey, the terrain gradually becoming less steep as they approached the point where Mason planned to descend toward town. From their elevated position, Whispering Pines was visible in the distance, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in the valley, smoke rising from chimneys, the white steeple of the church standing out against the darker structures surrounding it. It looked peaceful from a distance, Mason reflected. A typical frontier town, unremarkable except for the gold that had drawn settlers to this remote valley. Yet, beneath that ordinary appearance lay corruption and betrayal, secrets that had cost Margaret her life and now threatened her daughter. As they began their descent, moving carefully down a game trail that wound through dense scrub and scattered pines, Mason found himself considering what would come after, assuming they succeeded in retrieving Margaret's evidence and reaching the federal marshal in Helena. What then? Where would they go? What kind of life could he offer? Lily. These were questions he had never expected to face. His life since the war had been one of solitude, of quiet routine, broken only by the changing seasons and occasional trips to town for supplies. Now suddenly, he was responsible for a child, not just any child, but his daughter, a living connection to the woman he had loved and lost. The responsibility was daunting, yet Mason found he welcomed it. In the brief time since finding Lily, something had awakened in him that he had thought long dead, a sense of purpose, of belonging to something larger than himself. They were nearing the edge of the forest that bordered the eastern side of Whispering Pines when Mason held up a hand, signaling Lily to stop. He had caught a glimpse of movement among the trees ahead, a flash of color that didn't belong to the natural landscape. "Stay close," he whispered, drawing his pistol, "and be ready to run if I tell you." Lily pressed close to his side, her small body tense with fear, but her movements controlled. Mason advanced cautiously, using the trees for cover, his senses alert for any sound or movement. The flash of color appeared again, blue fabric among the green and brown of the forest. Mason raised his pistol, finger poised on the trigger. "Don't shoot, Reed," called a familiar voice. "I'm alone." Sheriff Logan Wells stepped into view, his hands raised to show he carried no weapon. His badge caught the sunlight filtering through the trees, and his expression was grim but not hostile. Mason kept his pistol trained on the sheriff, unwilling to trust too easily. "What are you doing here, Wells?" "Looking for you." Wells replied, his gaze shifting briefly to Lily, who half hid behind Mason. "Though I expected to find you closer to your ranch, not heading into town." "And why were you looking for us?" Mason pressed, not lowering his weapon. "Come to collect the bounty Blackwood's no doubt offering," Wells sighed, lowering his hands slowly. "No bounty, Reed. I came to warn you. Blackwood's gone mad with this hunt. He's got men at every road into town watching your old place, even stationed at Irene Faulkner's house." This last piece of information caught Mason's attention. "Why would he have men at Irene's?" "Because that's where he figures you're heading," Wells said. "After you escaped the fire, Blackwood seemed certain you'd try to reach Irene's house. Wouldn't say why, but he was adamant enough to post guards there round the clock." Mason exchanged a glance with Lily, whose wide eyes confirmed what he was thinking. Blackwood knew or suspected that Margaret had hidden evidence at her sister's house. The question was, did Irene know what she was harboring? "Why are you telling me this?" Mason asked, still suspicious of the sheriff's motives. Wells shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping briefly before meeting Mason's again. "Because I've been looking the other way too long," he admitted. "After you left yesterday, Blackwood went on a rampage, fired half the miners for failing to capture you, threatened the others. He's scared Reed, and a scared man with power is dangerous to everyone." "He should be scared," Mason said coldly. "He's got blood on his hands. Margaret Hayes didn't die in any accident." Wells nodded, surprising Mason with his agreement. "I suspected as much. Too convenient, that collapse happening when she was alone in the mine. But suspicion isn't proof, and Blackwood owns half the county judges." "We're going to get proof," Mason said, finally lowering his pistol, though he kept it in hand. "Evidence that will bring Blackwood down for good." "That's why you're heading to Irene's," Wells surmised. "You think Margaret left something there." Mason didn't confirm or deny, still not entirely trusting the sheriff's sudden attack of conscience. "What do you want, Wells? Why seek us out? Just to warn us?" The sheriff seemed to age before Mason's eyes, the lines in his face deepening with regret. "Because I've been part of this too long. Looked the other way while Blackwood built his empire on other people's misery. Told myself I was just keeping the peace, but the truth is I was afraid. Afraid of losing my badge, my standing. Afraid of ending up like the others who crossed him." "Others," Mason prompted, sensing there was more to this confession. "Thomas Hayes wasn't the first man Blackwood betrayed," Wells said, his voice dropping. "During the war, sure, but even after. Men who knew too much, who threatened his position, they had a way of disappearing or dying in convenient accidents." A chill ran down Mason's spine. "And you knew this, all this time?" Wells nodded, shame evident in his posture. "Not all of it. Enough to suspect. Enough that I should have done something years ago." Lily, who had been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "You knew my mama," she said, not a question, but a statement. "You knew she was afraid of Mr. Blackwood." Wells looked startled, as if he'd forgotten the child was there. His expression softened as he met her gaze. "Yes, I knew your mother. She was a good woman. Brave. Too brave for her own good, maybe. Brave enough to preserve evidence of Blackwood's crimes," Mason said. "Evidence we intend to recover." Wells was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally he said, "I can help you. I know a way into town that Blackwood's men aren't watching, and I can create a distraction while you get into Irene's house." Mason studied the sheriff, looking for any sign of deception. "Why would you risk your position now?" After all these years of looking the other way, maybe I'm tired of not being able to look myself in the mirror. Wells replied, a hint of defiance in his tone. Or maybe I just want to be on the right side of history for once. Either way, I'm offering help. Take it or leave it. Mason considered the offer. They needed all the assistance they could get, and if Wells was sincere, his knowledge of the town and Blackwood's operations could prove invaluable. The risk, of course, was that this was an elaborate trap designed to deliver them directly into Blackwood's hands. But something in the sheriff's demeanor, a weariness, a resignation that spoke of a man who had finally reached his breaking point, convinced Mason to take the chance. "All right," he said finally. "We'll accept your help. But understand this, Wells. If you betray us, if this is some trick to hand Lily over to Blackwood, I'll make sure you don't live to regret it." Wells nodded, accepting the threat as his due. "Fair enough. Now we should move. There's a service road that runs behind the livery stable. It's rarely used, and I made sure none of Blackwood's men are stationed there." They set off, Wells leading the way, Mason keeping Lily close at his side. The sheriff moved with the confidence of a man who knew the land well, guiding them through dense undergrowth and along barely visible game trails. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains by the time they reached the edge of town. The service road Wells had mentioned was little more than a rutted path overgrown with weeds and littered with discarded items from the nearby stable. It ran behind several buildings, offering cover from the main street, where Blackwood's men would likely be watching. "Irene's house is 3 blocks that way," Wells said, pointing. "The back garden has a high fence, but there's a gate that's rarely locked. The problem will be the men Blackwood has posted. 2 on the front porch, at least 1 circling the property." "And your distraction," Mason prompted. Wells smiled grimly. "I'm going to arrest Ezra Blackwood." Mason stared at him, sure he had misheard. "You're going to what?" "Arrest him," Wells repeated. "Publicly on the main street where everyone can see. It won't stick, he has too many friends in high places, but it will create one hell of a commotion. Every man Blackwood has in town will come running, including those watching Irene's house." "On what charge?" Mason asked, incredulous at the sheriff's audacity. "Conspiracy to commit murder," Wells said flatly. "Margaret Hayes' murder. I don't have proof that will stand up in court, but I don't need it for an arrest. Just reasonable suspicion." Mason shook his head, both impressed and concerned by the boldness of the plan. "They'll strip you of your badge for this. Maybe worse." Wells shrugged. "Probably. But maybe it's time I earned the right to wear it again." The plan was set. Wells would create his distraction in 20 minutes, giving Mason and Lily time to work their way close to Irene's house undetected. Once Blackwood's men abandoned their posts to respond to the commotion, Mason and Lily would enter through the garden gate, find the locked room, and recover Margaret's evidence. "What about Irene herself?" Mason asked as they prepared to separate. "Will she be home?" "She takes tea with the Ladies' Aid Society every Wednesday afternoon," Wells replied. "That's today. She won't be back until near dusk." With a final nod of acknowledgement, Wells departed, heading toward the main street where he would confront Blackwood. Mason and Lily waited in the shadow of the livery stable, counting the minutes. "Do you trust him?" Lily whispered, her small hand clutched in Mason's. "Not entirely," Mason admitted. "But I believe he wants to do the right thing. Sometimes that's enough." When the appointed time arrived, they moved out, keeping to the shadows and back alleys, avoiding the few pedestrians they encountered. In the distance, they heard a commotion beginning, raised voices, then a shout that could only be Wells making his move. They reached the high fence that surrounded Irene Faulkner's garden just as the guard who had been patrolling the property hurried away toward the main street, drawn by the increasing uproar. The gate, as Wells had predicted, was unlocked. Mason pushed it open cautiously, wincing at the slight creak of rusted hinges. The garden beyond was well tended with neat rows of vegetables and flowers arranged in geometric patterns. The house itself was 2 stories of painted clapboard, with a wraparound porch and numerous windows currently shuttered against the afternoon heat. "This way," Lily whispered, tugging Mason toward a side door that likely led to the kitchen. "Aunt Irene never locks this one." The door opened silently to Lily's push, revealing a kitchen that gleamed with polished copper and scrubbed surfaces. They moved through it quickly, Lily leading the way with the confidence of familiarity. Though Mason noticed how she flinched slightly as they passed certain spots, places he suspected where she had endured Irene's cruelty. The main staircase was in the front hall, too exposed if anyone should enter the house. But Lily knew of a servant's stair at the back, narrow and steep, that led directly to the upper floor. They ascended cautiously, every creak of the wooden steps seeming thunderously loud in the silent house. The upper hallway was dimly lit, the shuttered windows allowing only thin slices of sunlight to penetrate. Lily pointed to a door at the far end. "That's it," she whispered. "The locked room." They approached with caution, Mason's senses alert for any sound that might indicate they weren't alone. At the door, he examined the lock, a simple keyhole mechanism that would be difficult but not impossible to pick if he had the right tools. "The key is around Aunt Irene's neck," Lily reminded him, her voice barely audible. Mason nodded, thinking quickly. Breaking the door would create too much noise, potentially alerting anyone nearby. He needed a more subtle approach. From his pocket, he withdrew a small pouch containing the few personal items he carried. His folding knife, a stub of pencil, a small coil of wire he used for mending tack. The wire might serve as a makeshift lockpick. As he worked on the lock, bending the wire into shape and inserting it carefully into the keyhole, Mason kept one ear attuned to the sounds from outside. The commotion on the main street continued, suggesting Wells was successfully maintaining his distraction. The lock was stubborn, resisting his amateur attempts at picking. Mason persisted, sweat beading on his forehead, as he manipulated the wire, feeling for the mechanism within. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, he felt something give. The lock clicked softly, and the door swung inward on well-oiled hinges. The room beyond was unlike anything Mason had expected. Where the rest of the house was tidy to the point of sterility, this space was cluttered with objects that seemed to have no relationship to one another. Old dresses hanging on a standing rack, books stacked haphazardly on every surface, framed photographs and loose papers scattered across a desk by the window. "It's like a museum," Lily whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the chaotic collection. Mason understood immediately what they were seeing. This wasn't just a room, it was a shrine to Margaret Hayes, a space where Irene had gathered everything connected to her sister, whether out of grief, obsession, or some darker emotion. "Look for a wooden box," Mason instructed, moving toward the desk. "Your mother's box." They searched methodically, careful not to disturb the arrangement of objects more than necessary. Mason examined the papers on the desk, finding correspondence, legal documents, and pages that appeared to have been torn from a journal. None, however, mentioned Thomas Hayes or Ezra Blackwood's wartime activities. "Here," Lily's excited whisper came from the closet, where she had been searching among the stored dresses. "I found it." She emerged holding a wooden box about the size of a large book, its surface polished by years of handling. A small brass lock secured its lid, but the key was missing. Mason took the box, turning it over in his hands. It was lighter than he had expected, suggesting it might be empty. His heart sank at the possibility that they had come all this way for nothing, that Blackwood or Irene had already discovered and destroyed the evidence. "Let me try something," Lily said, taking the box back. She examined it carefully, her small fingers tracing the wood grain, pressing experimentally at various points. Suddenly, there was a soft click, and a hidden compartment in the bottom of the box slid open. "Mama showed me," Lily explained, her eyes bright with triumph. "She said some things are too important to lock with keys that can be stolen." Inside the hidden compartment lay a small leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, the binding worn from repeated handling. Mason recognized it immediately. Thomas Hayes's journal, the one he had kept throughout their imprisonment, the one that documented Blackwood's betrayal in Thomas's own handwriting. With trembling hands, Mason opened the journal, confirming its contents. There it was, detailed accounts of how Blackwood had sold information to Confederate agents, how he had arranged to be captured separately and given preferential treatment while his men suffered and died. Thomas had recorded names, dates, amounts, paid everything needed to prove Blackwood's treachery. But there was more. Tucked into the back of the journal were several folded documents, letters between Blackwood and Confederate officers, acknowledging receipt of information and confirming payment. And most damning of all, a signed confession from one of the Confederate guards who had been party to the arrangement, written after the war, when the man was dying and seeking to clear his conscience. It was everything they needed, irrefutable proof of Blackwood's wartime betrayal, evidence that would strip him of his position, his fortune, perhaps even his freedom. "We've got it," Mason breathed carefully, returning the documents to the journal. "This is what your mother died to protect." Lily nodded solemnly, understanding the significance of their discovery. "What now?" she asked. "Now we get out of here," Mason replied, securing the journal inside his shirt. "We find Wells, if he's still free, and make for Helena and the federal marshal." They had just reached the door when a sound from downstairs froze them in place, the front door opening, followed by voices. One was male, deep and authoritative. The other was female, with the precise clipped tones Mason recognized from his brief encounter with Irene Faulkner. "She's back early," Lily whispered, her face pale with fear. Mason put a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. They listened intently as the voices moved through the house below. "Certain they'll come here," Irene was saying, her tone skeptical. "It's where the evidence is," replied the male voice. Blackwood, Mason realized with a chill. "Margaret would have hidden it somewhere you would have access to, but wouldn't recognize. The girl will lead Reed right to it." "And then," Irene's voice was cold, calculating. "Then we finish what should have been finished at the cabin," Blackwood answered. "No witnesses, no evidence. Just an unfortunate accident befalling a man who kidnapped a child." Mason's blood ran cold. Blackwood had anticipated their move, perhaps even manipulated Wells into suggesting it. The commotion on the main street, the arrest, it could all have been an elaborate setup to draw them into a trap. "We need to go," he whispered to Lily. "Now." But the servant's stare was no longer an option. From the sound of footsteps, Blackwood and Irene were heading in that direction. The main staircase would leave them exposed in the front hall. They were effectively trapped on the upper floor. Mason thought quickly, assessing their options. The window in the locked room overlooked the garden. It was a long drop to the ground, too far for Lily to jump safely, but perhaps they could fashion a rope from the dresses in the closet. He led Lily back into the room, closing the door quietly behind them. Working swiftly, he selected several sturdy dresses from the rack and began tearing them into strips, knotting the fabric together to create a makeshift rope. "They're coming upstairs," Lily whispered, her ear pressed to the door. "I can hear them on the steps." Mason worked faster, his hands flying as he secured the last knots in their escape route. He moved to the window, pushing it open as quietly as possible. The garden lay below, empty for the moment, but he knew Blackwood likely had men stationed nearby. "You'll go first," he told Lily, tying one end of the fabric rope securely to the heavy desk. Climb down carefully. Once you reach the ground, run for the garden gate. I'll be right behind you." Lily nodded, her expression resolute despite the fear in her eyes. Mason helped her out the window, holding the rope steady as she began her descent, her small hands gripping the fabric tightly. He watched anxiously as she climbed down, her progress steady, but agonizingly slow. From the hallway came the sound of approaching footsteps, then a sharp exclamation as someone noticed the unlocked door. "They're in there!" Irene's voice called. Mason had no more time. Lily had reached the ground and was running for the garden gate. He swung himself out the window just as the door burst open behind him, Blackwood's enraged face appearing in the opening. "Read!" Blackwood shouted, lunging forward. Mason released his grip on the windowsill, sliding down the fabric rope faster than was safe, the rough material burning his palms. He hit the ground hard, stumbling but managing to keep his feet. Above, Blackwood was already leaning out the window, a pistol in hand. The first shot went wide, kicking up dirt near Mason's feet. He ran zigzagging to present a more difficult target, making for the garden gate where Lily waited, her face pale with fear. The second shot came closer, the bullet whistling past his ear. Mason reached Lily, pushing her through the gate ahead of him. They emerged into the alley beyond, just as Blackwood fired again, the bullet splintering the wooden fence beside them. "Run!" Mason urged, keeping Lily ahead of him as they fled down the alley. They had the journal and documents, but their position was precarious. Blackwood would soon have every available man searching for them, and the town offered limited places to hide. They needed to reach the safety of the hills, where they could lose themselves in the wilderness until they found a way to Helena. As they ran, Mason heard shouts behind them, Blackwood rallying his men, organizing the hunt. The distraction on the main street had evidently ended likely, with Wells being overpowered, or worse. They were on their own now, hunted through streets that had suddenly become hostile territory. They ducked into a narrow space between two buildings as a group of miners ran past, responding to Blackwood's call. Mason held Lily close, feeling her rapid heartbeat against his side. "We need to reach the livery stable," he whispered once the men had passed. "If we can get horses, we can outrun them." Lily nodded, her breathing shallow but controlled. "There's a back way," she offered. "Through the Chinese laundry. Mama showed me once." Mason followed her lead, trusting her knowledge of the town's hidden pathways. They moved carefully from one shadowed spot to another, avoiding the main thoroughfares where Blackwood's men would be watching. The Chinese laundry was a small, steam-filled building tucked between a boarding house and a chandler's shop. The elderly proprietor looked up in surprise as they entered through the front door, then quickly resumed his work, studiously ignoring their presence. Such deliberate blindness was often the only way for Chinese immigrants to survive in frontier towns where their presence was barely tolerated. Lily led the way through the hot, humid interior, past great vats of steaming water and racks of drying clothes, to a back door that opened onto a narrow alley. From there, it was only a short distance to the rear of the livery stable. The stable was quiet, most of the horses out with their owners or rented to visitors. Two remained in their stalls, a sturdy bay gelding and a smaller pinto mare that looked swift despite its size. "Can you ride alone?" Mason asked Lily as he quickly located saddles and bridles. "Mama taught me," she replied, already moving to help with the tack. "I'm small, but I'm strong." Mason saddled the horses as quickly as possible, his ears attuned to any sound that might indicate pursuit. He helped Lily mount the pinto, making sure she was secure in the saddle, then swung himself onto the bay. "We'll head east," he told her, "into the hills. Once we're clear of town, we'll circle north toward Helena." Lily nodded, gathering her reins with surprising confidence. For a moment, despite the danger, Mason felt a surge of pride in this child, who was proving as resilient and resourceful as her mother had been. They were about to leave through the stable's back door when a figure appeared in the opening, blocking their path. Sheriff Wells stood there, his uniform disheveled, a bruise darkening on his cheek, but his expression determined. "Wells," Mason acknowledged cautiously, uncertain whether the sheriff was friend or foe after the trap at Irene's house. "You got what you came for?" Wells asked, his gaze flicking to the slight bulge in Mason's shirt, where the journal was hidden. Mason nodded. "Thomas's journal. Everything we need to bring Blackwood down." Relief flashed across Wells's face. "Good. Now get moving. Blackwood's men caught me before I could create much of a distraction. They're searching the town block by block." "You're letting us go?" Mason asked, still suspicious. Wells stepped aside, clearing the path. "I'm doing what I should have done years ago, standing up to Blackwood, regardless of the cost." "Come with us," Mason offered, surprised to find he meant it. "To Helena. Testify about what you know." Wells shook his head. "My place is here. I can slow them down, give you a better head start." His gaze shifted to Lily, softening. "You take care of your father, young lady. He's a good man." Lily nodded solemnly. "I will, Sheriff." With a final nod of acknowledgement to Wells, Mason led the way out of the stable and into the open country beyond. They kept to a steady trot, at first not wanting to tire the horses too quickly, but as the sound of pursuit grew behind them, shouts the thunder of hooves, they urged their mounts to greater speed. The eastern hills rose before them, offering the promise of cover among the trees and rocky outcroppings. If they could reach the higher ground, they stood a chance of losing their pursuers in the wilderness beyond. The horses responded gallantly to the challenge, stretching into a ground-eating gallop that put distance between them and the town. Mason kept a close eye on Lily, ready to assist if she struggled, but she rode with surprising skill, staying low over the pinto's neck, moving in perfect rhythm with the animal's stride. They had nearly reached the first line of trees when shots rang out behind them. Blackwood's men firing from too great a distance to be accurate, but close enough to be a threat. Mason urged the bay to greater speed, Lily's pinto matching pace beside him. Then, suddenly, Lily's horse stumbled. The pinto recovered quickly, but the momentary break in stride was enough to throw Lily forward. She clung to the mare's neck, struggling to regain her balance, her small face tight with concentration. Mason maneuvered closer, ready to reach out and steady her if necessary. "Hold tight," he called. "We're almost there." Lily nodded, her jaw set with determination. She straightened in the saddle, regaining control, her hands steady on the reins. The pinto responded to her guidance, finding its stride again as they entered the shelter of the trees. The forest closed around them, the thick canopy overhead filtering the late afternoon sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter as the trees and undergrowth absorbed the noise, the uneven terrain, making it difficult for Blackwood's men to follow at speed. Mason led them deeper into the wilderness, following game trails where possible, creating their own path where necessary. The horses, sensing the urgency of their riders, continued without complaint, though Mason knew they would need rest soon. As dusk approached, they reached a small clearing beside a swift-flowing creek, a natural campsite that offered water for themselves and the horses, and enough open space to see anyone approaching. Mason called a halt, helping Lily dismount from her tired pinto. "We'll rest here for a bit," he decided, leading the horses to the creek. "Let the horses drink and catch their breath, then we'll continue north." Lily nodded, moving to help water the animals. Her small hands worked confidently as she loosened the pinto's girth to allow it to breathe more easily, brushing sweat from its neck with gentle strokes. "You ride well," Mason observed, impressed by her skill. A small smile touched Lily's lips. "Mama said it was in my blood." that my father was the best horseman she'd ever known. The simple statement, delivered without artifice, created a warm glow in Mason's chest. Margaret had spoken of him to their daughter, had kept his memory alive even when she believed they would never meet. "Your mother didn't exaggerate," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "She was quite the horsewoman herself." They tended to the horses in companionable silence, the routine tasks creating a sense of normalcy despite the danger that still pursued them. Mason kept a watchful eye on their back trail, but there was no sign yet that Blackwood's men had managed to follow them into the hills. As the light faded from the sky, replaced by the first stars of evening, Mason made a difficult decision. They couldn't risk a fire which might be seen by their pursuers. But continuing through unfamiliar wilderness in the dark posed its own dangers, especially with tired horses and an exhausted child. "We'll rest here until dawn," he told Lily, arranging his coat into a makeshift bed for her in the shelter of a large pine. "Sleep while you can. I'll keep watch." Lily settled onto the coat, her small body clearly weary, despite her attempts to hide it. "What about the men chasing us?" she asked, her voice heavy with impending sleep. "They'll have to stop for the night, too," Mason assured her. "Horses can't navigate these hills in the dark, not safely. We've bought ourselves some time." Lily nodded, her eyes already closing. Within minutes, she was asleep, her breathing deep and regular, her face peaceful in repose. Mason settled with his back against a tree trunk, positioned to watch both their back trail and Lily's sleeping form. The journal rested secure against his chest, its weight a reminder of all that had happened and all that was still at stake. They had the evidence now, but getting it to the federal marshal in Helena would not be easy. Blackwood would not give up the pursuit, not when his entire life, his position, his wealth, his freedom, depended on stopping them. The journey would be dangerous, especially with a child to protect. Yet, looking at Lily, at the daughter he had only just discovered, Mason felt a resolve that went beyond mere determination. This was no longer just about justice for Thomas Hayes, or even for Margaret. It was about securing a future for Lily, a future free from fear, from the shadow of Blackwood's influence, from the legacy of betrayal and loss that had defined her early years. The night deepened around them, the forest alive with the soft sounds of nocturnal creatures. Mason remained alert, his senses attuned to any noise that might signal danger. But his thoughts were on the future, on what would come after assuming they reached Helena safely and delivered the evidence to the proper authorities. What kind of father could he be to Lily? What kind of life could he offer her? His ranch was gone, burned to the ground. His life of solitude was no longer an option. Everything had changed in the space of 2 days, irrevocably altered by the appearance of a blue-eyed child with his stubborn chin and Margaret's gentle spirit. Yet amid the uncertainty, Mason felt a strange sense of peace. Whatever came next, they would face it together, father and daughter, bound by blood and by the promise of a new beginning. Dawn was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky when Mason heard it, the distant sound of horses approaching, moving carefully but steadily along their trail. Blackwood's men had continued the pursuit through the night, more determined than Mason had anticipated. He woke Lily with a gentle touch, his finger to his lips, signaling the need for silence. She came awake instantly, her eyes alert, her movements quiet, as she helped ready the horses. They mounted quickly, Mason leading the way deeper into the hills, following the creek that would eventually join the river flowing north toward Helena. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. Blackwood's men had picked up their trail and were closing the distance. The day that followed was a desperate race through increasingly rugged terrain. Mason pushed the horses as hard as he dared, conscious of the need to maintain their strength for what might be a long journey. Lily rode bravely beside him, her small face set with determination, never complaining despite the grueling pace. By midday, they had gained some distance on their pursuers, the sounds of the chase fading behind them. But Mason knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Blackwood's men would not give up, not when the stakes were so high. They paused briefly to rest the horses and drink from a clear spring that bubbled from a rocky outcropping. Lily's face was pale with fatigue, but her eyes remained clear and focused. "How much further to Helena?" she asked, sipping water from her cupped hands. 3 days' ride at least," Mason replied honestly, "but we won't have to go that far. There's a telegraph station at Copper Creek, a day's ride from here. If we can reach it, we can send word to the federal marshal, have him meet us halfway." Lily nodded, accepting this information with the same quiet resilience she had shown throughout their ordeal. "We'll make it," she said with a confidence that belied her years. Mason smiled, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Yes, we will." They had just remounted when the crack of a rifle shot echoed through the hills. Mason felt the bullet pass close enough to stir the air near his head, the report telling him it had come from a considerable distance. "Ride!" he shouted to Lily, spurring the bay into motion. They galloped along the creek bed, the horses' hooves throwing up spray as they splashed through shallow sections. More shots followed, most going wide, but one struck a tree near Lily's head, sending splinters flying. Mason maneuvered his horse closer to Lily's, providing what shield he could with his own body. Ahead, the creek curved around a large rock formation that would provide temporary cover. If they could reach it, they might gain enough time to lose their pursuers in the dense forest beyond. They were within yards of the sheltering rocks when disaster struck. Lily's pinto, perhaps stepping into a hidden hole or simply stumbling from fatigue, went down hard. The small mare crumpled, throwing Lily clear, but falling awkwardly, a shrill whinny of pain cutting through the air. Mason reined the bay to a sharp halt, leaping from the saddle even before the horse had fully stopped. Lily lay motionless on the ground, the breath knocked from her body by the fall. The pinto struggled to rise, but its front leg was clearly broken, the bone visible through the skin. In one swift motion, Mason drew his pistol and ended the pinto's suffering with a clean shot. Then he was at Lily's side, heart pounding with fear, as he gently turned her over. "Lily, Lily, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition. "The horse?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't worry about that now," Mason said quickly, checking her for injuries. Beyond scrapes and bruises, she seemed largely unharmed, though the shock of the fall had left her dazed. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Blackwood's men had heard the shot and were closing in, sensing their quarry's vulnerability. Mason helped Lily to her feet, supporting her as she swayed slightly. "Can you ride?" he asked, gesturing to the bay which stood nearby, nostrils flaring with the scent of blood, but otherwise steady. Lily nodded, grimacing, as she tested her weight on a scraped knee. "I can ride." Mason lifted her onto the bay's back, then mounted behind her, cradling her small body against his chest. The bay snorted at the double burden, but moved forward willingly when Mason pressed his heels to its sides. They continued at a slower pace, the bay laboring under their combined weight. Mason knew they could no longer outrun their pursuers. Their only hope now was to find a defensive position somewhere they could make a stand until help arrived or night fell. The rock formation ahead offered possibilities. Mason guided the bay toward it, scanning the terrain for a spot that would provide both cover and a clear line of sight to anyone approaching. He found it on the far side of the formation, a natural alcove in the rock, sheltered on 3 sides with the creek running directly in front. From this position they could see anyone approaching from the direction of their pursuers, and the creek would force riders to slow, making them easier targets. Mason dismounted, helping Lily down and leading her to the sheltered spot. The bay he left ground-tied nearby, ready for a quick escape if opportunity presented itself. "Stay low," he instructed Lily, positioning her in the deepest part of the alcove. "No matter what happens, don't show yourself until I tell you it's safe." Lily's eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded her trust in him, evident despite the danger. "What are you going to do?" Mason checked his rifle and pistol, counting his remaining ammunition. Not enough for a prolonged engagement, but perhaps sufficient to hold off their pursuers until darkness fell. "I'm going to make sure that journal reaches the federal marshal," he said, patting the bulge in his shirt where Thomas's journal rested. "One way or another." From the determined set of his jaw, Lily seemed to understand what he wasn't saying, that he would give his life if necessary to ensure she and the evidence reached safety. "Papa," she said, the word emerging naturally as if she had been saying it all her life. "Be careful." The simple word "Papa" struck Mason with unexpected force, a rush of emotion sweeping through him. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that he would do whatever was necessary to protect this child, his daughter, the living legacy of his love for Margaret Hayes. "I will," he promised, touching her cheek gently. "Now stay hidden and stay quiet." Mason positioned himself at the edge of the alcove, rifle ready, his eyes fixed on the approach from the direction they had come. The sounds of pursuit grew steadily louder. Hoofbeats, men's voices calling to one another as they followed the clear trail left by the bay. The first rider appeared around the bend in the creek, reining his horse to a halt as he spotted the dead pinto. He signaled to those behind him, pointing toward the rock formation where Mason and Lily had taken shelter. Mason counted at least 6 men, Blackwood among them, his expensive coat now dusty and disheveled from the chase. They spread out, approaching cautiously, aware that their quarry was cornered, but still dangerous. "Reed," Blackwood called, his voice carrying clearly across the intervening space. "It's over. Send out the girl and the journal, and you can walk away." Mason didn't bother responding to the obvious lie. Instead, he took careful aim at a rock near Blackwood's horse, firing a shot that sent splinters flying and caused the animal to rear in alarm. "That's your only warning," Mason shouted as Blackwood struggled to control his mount. "The next one finds flesh." The miners with Blackwood exchanged uneasy glances. They had signed on for a manhunt, perhaps, but facing a cornered veteran with deadly aim was more than they had bargained for. "He's one man," Blackwood snarled, noting their hesitation. "6 of us. The odds are in our favor." "The odds didn't help the last bunch you sent after us," Mason called, deliberately sowing discord among the already uncertain group. "Ask them how it felt to be shot." One of the miners, a burly man with a thick beard, spat into the dirt. "I didn't sign on for this, Blackwood. Chasing a man and his kid through the hills getting shot at? You can keep your money." "Coward," Blackwood hissed. But the damage was done. 2 of the miners were already turning their horses, unwilling to risk their lives in what was clearly Blackwood's personal vendetta. Blackwood watched them go, his face twisted with rage. But even with his numbers reduced, he wasn't ready to concede defeat. He dismounted, drawing his own rifle, and took cover behind a large boulder. "It doesn't matter how many walk away," he called to Mason. "You're still trapped. Night's coming, and with it, a storm." He gestured to the western sky, where dark clouds were indeed gathering. "How long can you protect the girl out here, Reed? She's already injured from the fall. How long before exposure, hunger, or fever claims her?" The words were calculated to strike at Mason's greatest fear, that despite his best efforts, he would fail to protect Lily. But they had the opposite effect, reinforcing his determination. "We've survived worse than a storm, Blackwood," he replied steadily. "Have you? How long before your remaining men realize they're risking their lives for a traitor? How long before the truth about Thomas Hayes reaches those who can act on it?" A shot rang out from behind Blackwood's boulder, the bullet striking the rock face near Mason's position, showering him with stone fragments. He returned fire, his shot more carefully aimed, clipping the edge of the boulder and forcing Blackwood to duck lower. The exchange of fire continued sporadically as the afternoon waned, neither side gaining a clear advantage. Mason was careful with his ammunition, making each shot count, while Blackwood's men fired more freely, perhaps hoping to wear down their opponent through sheer volume of lead. As predicted, the storm began to roll in as evening approached the western sky, darkening ominously. The first rumble of thunder echoed through the hills, and fat raindrops began to patter against the leaves and rocks. Mason retreated deeper into the alcove, checking on Lily. She sat huddled against the rock wall, her face pale but composed. The scrape on her knee had stopped bleeding, but her clothes were damp from the increasing rain, and she shivered slightly in the cooling air. "How are you holding up?" Mason asked softly, crouching beside her. "I'm okay," she replied, though her voice wavered slightly. "Are they going to leave when it gets dark?" Mason wished he could offer reassurance, but he wouldn't lie to her. "I don't think so. Not Blackwood, at least. He has too much to lose." Lily nodded, accepting this harsh reality with the same quiet courage she had shown throughout their ordeal. "What are we going to do?" Mason considered their options, none of which seemed promising. They could try to slip away in the darkness, but with only one horse and Lily injured, their chances of outpacing their pursuers were slim. They could continue to hold their position, hoping that hunger or the worsening weather would drive off Blackwood's remaining men, but that too was a gamble, especially with Lily's condition to consider. Or they could try something unexpected, something that might create an opportunity for at least one of them to escape with the journal. Mason reached into his shirt, withdrawing Thomas Hayes's journal. The leather binding was worn, but still sturdy, the pages within containing the truth that could bring down Ezra Blackwood and provide justice for Thomas, for Margaret, and for all those who had suffered from Blackwood's betrayal. "Lily," Mason said, his voice low and serious, "I need you to listen carefully. What I'm about to ask of you is difficult, but it may be our only chance." He explained his plan, a desperate gambit that would separate them temporarily, but might allow Lily to escape with the journal while Mason created a diversion to draw off their pursuers. "I don't want to leave you," Lily protested, her eyes filling with tears for the first time since their ordeal began. "It won't be for long," Mason assured her, though he knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. "Follow the creek north, just like we discussed. It will lead you to Copper Creek and the telegraph station. Ask for the operator, Mr. Chen. Tell him you need to reach Federal Marshal James Parker in Helena. Give him the journal and tell him everything that's happened." "What about you?" Lily asked, her small hand clutching his. "How will you find me?" Mason squeezed her hand gently. "I'll come for you as soon as I can. If I'm delayed, Marshal Parker will make sure you're safe until I arrive." The doubt in Lily's eyes told him she wasn't convinced that she understood the risk he was taking. But she was also her mother's daughter, practical and brave when it mattered most. "All right," she agreed finally. "But you have to promise to try your hardest to come back. Promise me." "I promise," Mason said, the words carrying the weight of a sacred vow. "Nothing will keep me from finding you again." As the storm intensified, rain falling in sheets that limited visibility, and the thunder providing cover for any movement, Mason helped Lily secure the journal inside her shirt, wrapping it carefully to protect it from the weather. "Wait for my signal," he instructed, checking the bay's saddle one last time. "When you hear me firing rapidly, that's when you go. Don't look back. Don't stop for anything. Just ride north along the creek, as fast as the bay can carry you." Lily nodded, her small face solemn in the gathering darkness. Without warning, she threw her arms around Mason's neck, hugging him fiercely. "I love you, Papa," she whispered against his ear, the words simple but profound. Mason's throat tightened with emotion. "I love you too, Lily," he replied, holding her close for what might be the last time. "Now and always." The moment stretched between them, a fragile bubble of connection amid the chaos of their circumstances. Then Mason gently disengaged, helping Lily mount the bay, making sure she was secure in the saddle. "Remember," he said, "wait for my signal. Then ride like the wind." With one final touch to her hand, Mason moved away from the alcove, circling wide to approach Blackwood's position from an unexpected direction. The rain had turned the ground to mud, making his progress slower than he would have liked, but also masking any sounds he might make. Through the curtain of rain, Mason could make out the glow of a small fire where Blackwood and his remaining men had established their camp. They had clearly settled in for a siege, confident that their quarry was trapped and would eventually be forced to surrender. Mason moved closer, his rifle ready. He needed to create enough of a distraction to draw all of Blackwood's men away from the creek, giving Lily a clear path to escape. It was a desperate plan with little chance of success for himself, but if it meant Lily and the journal reached safety, it would be worth any cost. When he was in position, Mason took a deep breath, steadying himself for what was to come. Then he fired 3 shots in rapid succession, aiming at the fire, and the figures huddled around it. Chaos erupted in the camp. Men shouted in alarm, scrambling for weapons. Blackwood's voice rose above the din, issuing orders directing his men toward the source of the attack. Mason fired again, then changed position, quickly moving through the darkness to fire from another angle, creating the impression of multiple attackers. He heard Blackwood calling for his men to spread out, to flank the unseen assailants. From the corner of his eye, Mason saw movement near the creek, Lily on the bay, riding hard northward, her small figure quickly swallowed by the darkness and rain. Relief surged through him. She was away, carrying the journal and the hope for justice with her. Now he needed only to keep Blackwood and his men occupied long enough for her to gain sufficient distance. Mason continued his hit-and-run tactics, firing from different positions, drawing Blackwood's men further from the creek and deeper into the surrounding forest. His ammunition was running low, but he had achieved his primary goal. Lily was safely away, and their pursuers were thoroughly confused. He was preparing to make his own escape when a voice spoke from directly behind him. "That was quite a performance, Reed." Mason froze, then turned slowly to find himself facing Ezra Blackwood, a pistol leveled steadily at his chest. The man's clothes were sodden, his normally immaculate appearance marred by mud and scratches from the underbrush, but his eyes burned with the same cold hatred Mason remembered from years ago. "The girl got away," Mason said, a statement rather than a question. "With the journal." Blackwood's mouth twisted in a snarl. "For now. But how far do you think a child can go alone in this wilderness? My men will find her by morning." "Your men have deserted you," Mason countered, noting that Blackwood was indeed alone. "They're not willing to die for your crimes, Blackwood." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Blackwood's face, quickly masked. "It doesn't matter. The girl will be found, the journal recovered, and you, Reed, will not live to see it." Mason tensed, preparing for what might be his final moments, but he felt no fear, only a strange sense of completion. He had found his daughter. He had set in motion the wheels of justice for Thomas and Margaret. Whatever happened now, those achievements could not be taken from him. "You won't win this time, Blackwood," Mason said quietly. "The truth has a way of emerging, no matter how hard men like you try to bury it." Blackwood's finger tightened on the trigger. "We'll see about that." The shot when it came was deafening despite the storm's rumble. But to Mason's shock, it was not Blackwood's pistol that fired. Instead, the man staggered, a look of surprise spreading across his face as he looked down at the spreading crimson stain on his chest. Behind him stood Sheriff Logan Wells, his own pistol still raised, smoke curling from the barrel despite the rain. "I told you I was tired of looking the other way," Wells said as Blackwood collapsed to his knees, the unfired pistol falling from his suddenly nerveless fingers. Mason stared in disbelief. "Wells, how?" "Followed you," the sheriff explained, lowering his weapon. "Lost your trail for a while in the storm, but then I heard the shooting. Figured you might need some help." Blackwood gasped, blood bubbling at his lips as he struggled to speak. You'll hang for this, Wells." The sheriff shook his head. "I don't think so. Not when the federal marshal hears about your wartime treason or Margaret Hayes's murder. I reckon they'll call this justice long overdue." Blackwood's eyes, already glazing with approaching death, fixed on Mason with hatred. "The girl," he whispered. "She'll never be safe. Irene." Whatever final threat he meant to utter died with him as he slumped forward, his life's blood mingling with the rain-soaked earth. Mason looked from Blackwood's body to Wells, still struggling to process the sudden turn of events. "You shot him," he said, stating the obvious in his shock. Wells holstered his pistol with a grimace. Seemed like the right thing to do. Man like that, he wasn't going to stop. Not ever. Mason nodded slowly, the truth of the statement undeniable. "Lily," he said, suddenly remembering his daughter riding alone through the storm. "She's got the journal heading for Copper Creek. We need to find her." "My horse is back that way," Wells said, gesturing. "Strong enough to carry us both. If we ride hard, we might catch up to her before dawn." They moved quickly through the darkness, leaving Blackwood's body where it had fallen. The storm was beginning to abate, the rain lessening to a steady drizzle, the thunder moving eastward. Wells's horse, a sturdy black gelding, carried them both willingly following the creek northward at a pace that balanced speed with safety in the treacherous conditions. As they rode, Mason explained everything: the journal, the evidence it contained, Margaret's death, and Irene Faulkner's possible involvement. "Always suspected something wasn't right about Margaret's death," Wells admitted. "The timing was too convenient for Blackwood, but I never had proof, and Irene was quick to claim guardianship of the girl." "Did you know?" Mason asked. "About Lily being my daughter." Wells shook his head. "Not until I saw you together. The resemblance is clear once you're looking for it. Margaret kept that secret well." They rode through the night, the storm clearing, to reveal a sky brilliant with stars. The creek led them unerringly northward toward Copper Creek and the telegraph station where Lily would have sought help. Dawn was breaking when they finally saw it, a small settlement nestled in a valley smoke, rising from a few chimneys, the telegraph lines visible against the lightening sky. And there, near the station itself, a familiar bay horse stood being tended by a slender Chinese man, while a small figure sat on the station's porch, wrapped in a blanket. "Lily!" Mason breathed relief washing through him. She looked up at the sound of approaching hooves, her tired face lighting with joy as she recognized the riders. "Papa!" she cried, dropping the blanket and running toward them, despite her fatigue and injuries. Mason dismounted before Wells had fully halted the horse, striding forward to meet his daughter. Lily launched herself into his arms with a sob that was equal parts relief and happiness, her small body trembling with emotion. "You came back," she whispered against his chest. "You promised, and you came back." "Always," Mason replied, holding her close, the word both acknowledgement and vow. "Always." Over Lily's head, Mason saw the telegraph operator watching them with a satisfied smile. "The journal?" he asked Lily. "Safe," she assured him. Mr. Chen sent the message to Marshal Parker. "He's coming from Helena, should be here by tomorrow." The future stretched before them, still uncertain in many ways, but fundamentally changed from the solitary existence Mason had known before. There would be a formal investigation, testimonies to give, decisions to make about where they would live and how they would rebuild their lives. But in this moment, holding his daughter in his arms under the brightening sky, Mason Reed knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The echoes of the past, the betrayals, the losses, the grief would always be part of their story, but they would no longer define it. "What happens now?" Lily asked, looking up at him with Margaret's blue eyes. Mason smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Now we go home." "But the cabin is gone," Lily pointed out, practical as always. "Home isn't a place, Lily," Mason told her softly. "It's the people you love. And for us, home is wherever we're together." As the sun rose fully over the eastern mountains, bathing the valley in golden light, father and daughter walked hand in hand toward the telegraph station, toward the promise of justice long delayed, and toward the future they would build together. Behind them, Sheriff Wells watched with a sense of completion of wrongs finally set right. The truth about Ezra Blackwood would soon be known to all. Margaret Hayes would have the justice she deserved, and a father and daughter separated by war and circumstance had found their way back to each other. It was Wells reflected as he turned to tend to the horses, perhaps the closest thing to a happy ending this harsh frontier would allow, and for now, that was enough.